hard.
What is up, you heathens and demons? You beautiful people, welcome back to A Raging Atheist. Socka was back at home, and I wanted to take the opportunity to have him on, so I got Socka and Drag here. Ali's here, of course. I thought John was going to be here, but he got a headache. He's not feeling well, so he's not going to be here. Converse Contender might be coming in later, and I think Dragnauct might be trying to get a couple people, but... Yeah, it's been too long since I've had Dragon Socka on one of my streams. I've been on John's stream a couple times with him, but yeah, nice to have you guys back. And what's up, Ali?
Hey, not too much. I've spent most of today editing the response that we've been teasing for way too freaking long. SNS is doing a series of response videos against spirit science because there's a lot of woo but not a heck of a lot of science, and they pride themselves so much on the two videos that we're looking at right now on we've got our links in the description and we've got all of our sources and the iCards and blah blah blah, and it's like, did you read your sources? And why are you citing an encyclopedia? So, we are having a lot of fun with that. I am not having fun with the editing. Audio editing sucks. I'm going to have a lot more fun once it gets to the video. But yeah, that's what I've been doing. But thank you guys so much for showing up. Dragnaught, Socka Count. I haven't talked to either of you in forever. The last time I talked to Socka, he and I got into a debate about the golden mean. And the last time I talked to Dragnaught, your philosopher's pocket guide or something like that, and so you can't have a real conversation. So I really enjoyed actually getting to hash that stuff out with you.
Yeah,
let me know if the screen is buffering, chat. It could just be my computer.
No, just tell them to refresh.
Yeah, there's because I'm no longer a serious YouTube content creator. I don't get the luxury to make do this stuff anymore.
Yeah, he was a serious content creator for a while.
Yeah, like there was like a 2-month span where I was the most serious.
A lot of sarcasm there, folks.
Just
can't detect it. A lot of sarcasm.
So what's been going on with you, Drag? Like over on your channel and stuff? I haven't seen you in forever. You haven't even been on one of John's streams in a while.
Yeah, I've just been kind of working on stuff in the background. A lot of people have now kind of heard that I was on the Atheist Experience and that sort of thing, and so yeah, I'm kind of working with Matt, and we're going to be doing some more stuff on that front in the future, and so
that's exciting.
No, it was definitely fun. There are definitely plans to go back, and I'm still trying to kind of decide what I want to do as far as how I want to have things arranged, because that took a lot of coordination, because I do have a child. I will be starting school not this week but next week, and
I was about to say, how's school been going, because I know you're on winter break right now.
No, I have actually one more full semester, and then I'll have my bachelor's, pretty much.
Hey,
no, and then it's on to grad school. So
that is the slog, man, is fucking grad school.
Yeah, that's gonna be the real fun. So I am looking forward to it, because it's going to be kind of a different beast. I've already taken graduate course, so I'm already familiar with kind of the difficulty and the I guess, the atmosphere.
Well,
So
it's
that
kind of a shock to your system, right? Like you get out of high school and then you get to college, and college is radically different. At least if you go straight to university. Like if you go to community college, you kind of get a bit of a transition. You know, you still get homework and shit like that, but like
right.
if you go straight to university, it's such a radical shift. And grad school was kind of the same. Like it's a lot tougher and it's a lot more self-directed in some cases.
Oh yeah, very, very much so. And it's something that not a lot of people are used to. And so it's good to kind of be introduced to that sort
Independence?
of
What's
thing.
this?
Yeah, really, really, it's really self-driven. Because if you're not, yeah, you're gonna fall behind. You're not gonna do very well. So, it's where the rubber meets the road. But
It's where they
uh,
separate the wheat from the chaff, really. You gotta fucking want it to get through grad school. You are paying for a full-time job.
oh yeah, oh yeah. But yeah, I'm doing that. I'm trying to make myself more available for folks who want to get into having debates or whatever, that sort of thing. But I'm definitely working on the Magic Sandwich Show more so than my own channel, because that, like, the stuff that happens on my channel, that's there for entertainment, mostly, stuff for folks to kind of think about, and not really take really seriously. But it's a mixture of, okay, here's some things that's going on with this person or that person. Here are my thoughts on it. Take it with a grain of salt, and just kind of enjoy it. And so that's kind of what I relegated my channel for. But the Magic Sandwich Show is kind of a different beast entirely, where I'll bring somebody like Alex Malpass on, and some other people, like one of the guys I invited today, Justin Wilson, and they'll talk about the Grim Reaper paradox and the Kalam cosmological argument, and it just goes over everyone's head. But you listen to it, and you might listen to it a few times to really understand what they're getting at. And man, it's a lot of deep, heavy philosophical stuff that half of it I don't understand.
The last stream you and I were both in, wasn't it? Was the Kalam cosmological argument. We were talking about that.
I believe so. Actually, I believe so.
Yeah, because there was a video that somebody had put out recently on it, and so you wanted to talk about the video and about Kalam as a whole, and so yeah, that was a pretty dang informative stream. That was fun.
Yeah, no, that's stuff that kind of people want to see and get into. Most definitely, I'll do a little bit more on it. Philosophy is not really my thing, but it's definitely important to know what people believe, even if it is not really your wheelhouse. And just being familiar with it, I think, will help folks in the long run, help them understand how others come to the conclusions that they come to, as far as their belief in certain deities, or what they believe to be as good evidence for it.
Well, and I think that one of my favorite things, I think I might have read it somewhere, but I remember saying it to Knock forever ago. Everybody is doing philosophy all the time. It's just whether or not you're doing it well, which is to say consciously. Having kind of an understanding in various philosophical arguments and theories and things can help you just be a more, I guess, organized thinker, for lack of a better way to put it. You can understand why you think what you think, and it's gives you a framework to kind of examine your personal beliefs a little more thoroughly, which I think is really, really amazing. I think everybody should learn some level of philosophy.
And what's great about that is that kind of segues into one of the things I was telling you guys beforehand that I wouldn't mind talking about, and it's this idea of critical thinking and skepticism. What I've noticed a lot, and recently I was watching a hangout where the topic of critical thinking came up, and it was atrocious listening to two people try to explain what critical thinking was. And I understand there's a lot of these concepts that are you're not going to find like a really good textbook definition, especially for something like critical thinking, which breaks down to more of a kind of like a methodology than anything else. And people get this. So
having made such a sweeping statement, do you have a particular definition that you're fond of?
Well, it's the same way that I approach a lot of things. Like when I did when we had to talk about abduction. When I say that something is an explanation, what are the virtues of something that makes it a good explanation? And it's the same thing that when it comes to the process of critical thinking, critical thought, what are the virtues that I want to try to embody within my thoughts and what I'm saying? And in that case, I would say that it would be the system itself, noticing any type of inconsistencies, being able to identify and recognize logical arguments, and being able to understand where your biases lie. Like those would be the where I would start this off. So to kind of like dive further into these is that like first off is that you have to have some type of system. You have to have some type of method in which you kind of evaluate things. Point A to point B on this one here. So, if I want to get to the bottom of this, how am I going to do this? Like, where should I start looking? And be very almost introspective in the way that you approach a problem. Understand that, yeah, like you can have gut reactions that can come to the that you can conclude things from, but you always want to make sure that you have that ability to look down and be like, okay, well, why am I having this reaction? There's certain things that we're going to come to, like conclusions that we will come to automatically, and we'll probably be right, in our analysis of these things. But you want to be able to that you at least have some type of system in place that you can walk it back and you can understand it. And this would can fall under a lot of different schools of thought. This is where you can get into things like epistemology and all that jazz. But then on top of that is that you want to be able to recognize that like when you're saying something that's contracted, like that's contradiction. That when you've come across something that you're not just blocking it away. Like you'll see this a lot of times is that people will have inconsistencies in their belief. Like they can believe something that's logically consistent.
I forgot to unmute. So can I try to untangle it a little bit? Because we're kind of starting to get into dissertation territory. So I'm going to try to backtrack a little bit and try to summarize what I understand of what you're saying. So basically to you, critical thinking is the ability to recognize potential contradictions and question them, the ability to recognize your own internal biases that might lead you to believe something that may have contradiction in it, or, miss said contradictions, and then having a process by which to either attempt to resolve those contradictions or at the very least get down to a possible explanation. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
God, I should hire you just to, just say the shit that I say, but better.
Well,
that's why I made her a co-host.
I write for a living. My job is to, get the words out of the way so that I can make my point.
Yeah,
it's funny because I have notes on this, but like I was telling you, like I'm running around the kitchen right now making dinner, so it's really hard to draw back on this and do it by memory. But no, that's the that's pretty much it. Like, so you want to be doing stuff that just like highlights these points, but and a lot of these things gets wrapped up within the system, recognizing contradictions, recognizing the inconsistencies, understanding, what it means for, the logical side of things. But where we lose out on this, a lot of times, hey buddy, come on, get out of here. Okay, cool. Where we lose out on it a lot of times is when it comes to understanding our own biases. And I think that is the weakest point that people have when it comes to actually doing any type of critical thinking, is trying to really get around those internal biases that we do have.
Well, and to a certain degree, I don't think it's possible to completely get through all of them, though there are a number of frameworks, kind of like what you were talking about when you said, do you have a structure that you can use to solve these problems? There are a number of frameworks that can try to assist with the monumental task of getting through your biases, particularly when you're working on a topic that you have a great deal of biases about. But it's nearly impossible to remove subjectivity from humanity because you can only truly speak from experience. You only know what you have had access to and what your experience has taught you.
Right.
Whether that experience is reading a book or having lived something, regardless, you only can function from within that framework.
Yeah, and well, subjectivity is obviously something that we can't get rid of. It's something that we should recognize should not be part of the conclusion that we come to, and that's one of the problems that we have is that people will take a look at their it's a thing
Depends on the
that
topic that you're discussing. I think that there are
Oh,
some
absolutely.
things that subjectivity absolutely applies to, but I think that there are some that it doesn't. So I think it depends on what topic we're talking about. Then that's where I think critical thinking can become complicated, because critical thinking in, say, mathematics or science is very different than critical thinking in other subjects. So,
Yeah, well, I would put in the sense of critical thinking in terms of coming to. Um, so if you're dealing with something that you could probably measure with some degree of objectivity. So coming to the conclusion about truth propositions, about reality, about the state of affairs. In those cases, there is the conclusion could be derived completely from objective basis. You wouldn't need to have any something subjective to that. There are some things I think that I feel are inherently just subjective. But then again, that's not always going to be the case. There's certain things that you aren't going to be able to do because they're just by definition irrational. As in, like there's they contain no truth value to it. So they like a good example of this, like human relations, for example. It's really hard to bring in critical thinking when you talk about the relationships that people have. So
well, there's a certain degree of that's true. Like, if you've ever tried to justify why you care about somebody, like, you're going to end up running into a wall. Like, you can talk about the things you enjoy about them, you can talk about the memories you have, but really, when you try to nail down, why do I care about this person, the answer is technically, on a literal sense, a hormonal reaction that happens in your brain. But why that particular reaction happened with that particular person might be a mystery to you. Versus if you're talking about, say, you're in a relationship and you're trying to figure out whether or not the relationship is continuing to benefit you in your life, well, then there's a certain amount of critical thinking, and the rooting out of biases becomes very, very important. Like, if you're trying to determine if a spouse is abusive, for example, and they've never physically touched you, but there's, snide comments and sarcasm in the way they treat you with friends and things like that. So critical thinking could actually be very, very key when it comes to that sort of relationship, or trying to figure out if your boss or a coworker is, causing you problems in your life, or trying to figure out, hey, I've been saying yes to too many people. Why have I been doing that? So critical thinking can even be useful in that instance, I think.
Well, I see. I'm not quite sure, because like those especially when we talk about like find out whether you said something
there. All these like squirming around and adjusting. That's the back thing that I was talking about. I'm about ready to make my husband load the vape for me, to be honest, because I can't go running up there.
Yeah, but I do think that the justification part comes in, but a lot of times the other thing, or sorry, not the justification, the personal bias thing, comes in huge, that needs to be addressed. But the other one is just that what people will try to do is they'll conflate critical thinking with skepticism as well, about being a skeptic. I've come to this position because I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical because I'm a critical thinker about these things. I just don't buy into it. They'll say things like that, and that they don't understand that the skepticism itself is very loosely defined as that doubt. It's really hard to talk about skepticism without doubt, but it's not just unwarranted doubt. If I doubt that gravity is going to maintain for the next 5 seconds, that's not me being a rational skeptic. Because I don't really have warrant in that level of that level of doubt. But that's where we get this as well, where just like we have a lot of people who say, well, I believe, I'm not saying that this is the case. I'm just saying that I just doubt it. I hold to a position of doubt. Or people that will try to make statements like that their doubt influences their beliefs, so that they feel like it's a choice, that they can believe what they want to believe. It's a hot mess.
I mean, what about human thinking and, psychology and such isn't, to be fair? Like, we're trying to use the very organ that we're analyzing to analyze itself, which it's remarkable that it can do that to any degree, but still.
Yeah, I totally agree, Socka, that I don't think a lot of people look at their personal biases. I try to be very open about mine. I think I see mine. I think I have a pretty good idea of what I am, but I don't think a lot of people really look at themselves. They look at others. And we do have
What
Darth
are the
Dawkins in the
what are the
chat.
best ways? One of the best ways that I feel that you can do this is do that, almost do that intersubjective analysis with other people. Like what's a better way of ruling out your own biases than to talk to other people about it. Like that. I think that does work. And while there's definitely epistemic problems with that, I think that it's a good start. When it comes to just analyzing some of the things you have. So like being able to take on board other people's positions also really helps out recognize your own biases.
Yeah. I don't claim to be too much of a critical thinker. I think I'm getting better. Like, I'm definitely improving. I haven't had a drink in 12 days, so I've noticed like the 2 debates that I've done since I've stopped drinking, I've performed a lot better. I've been able to really dive into the arguments to understand what arguments I was going against. But I hear what you're saying. Like when I have political debates, which is probably the best thing, the thing that I can really debate best. Like I like having conversations. I don't really like debating, but if I'm going to debate, I can debate politics best. It's really easy for me to bypass my biases because I see them and really work towards the biases of my opponent. And it's whether that opponent is right leaning or left leaning. It usually actually happens more with the left leaning. It's a lot easier for me to use their biases against them because they just don't see them at all.
Yeah, it's good that you acknowledge kind of where your limitations are, because I think too often, and I've seen this more so from non-believers than believers, is that to get to a point where they believe that they've reached kind of like the pinnacle or near the pinnacle of rational thought or skepticism or whatever buzzword you want to throw in there, and that they won't actually acknowledge that the way that they are viewing a particular topic or a subject is simply based on the fact that it's from somebody they like. They heard something that just really jive with them, and they just stuck to it and never really took the time to do any type of
Mm-hmm.
internal critiques or anything of the sort on that
Yeah,
topic. And
I noticed that.
Well,
it's
and I
yeah.
mean, it can get even more insidious than that. Even there was a study that came out not too long ago that showed that people would read like fake news headlines and things, and months later they would remember the headline but not remember the source, even though it was in the study. It was clearly revealed to them what the source was, and so people would recall it, and they would recall it as fact. And so you can be exposed to misinformation and through your own inadvertent cognitive bias, not even realize that you had been deceived, or even if you knew you had been deceived, not realize, months down the line that the thing that you remember, you may not even be able to recall the source, but you remember the thing. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, I was gonna say, like, I noticed, like what Drag was saying, like, I noticed that about myself as I was doing my year in review, and I was going back through all of my really early streams when I first started streaming. That, I would say things that, yeah, I probably picked up here or picked up there, heard somebody say here, heard somebody say there, and I was presenting them as like facts, and I know what the hell I was talking about. And as the year progressed, I could really see as I'm meeting people and having in-depth conversations, learning new things, that how some of the arguments that I used to use, I just don't even use them anymore because I learned, yeah, I didn't know what the hell I was talking about.
It takes a lot to actually like outwardly say that. Like you don't find too many people, lately really acknowledge that. You know what? I was just absolutely wrong about that, and the way that I approach things was just erroneous. And so, you have to go back to the drawing board. But it comes down kind of to a lack of introspection. It's easy
Yeah.
to point out the flaws in other people's arguments. It's really hard to point out the ones in your own. And as the years have gone by, I've sort of altered the way that I've approached a lot of topics, especially when I'm discussing, something scientific with someone. And Dr. Josh was one of the people who actually picked up on one of my habits where he knows that I won't actually use the technical terms for things. I'll avoid it unless I'm trying to make a point. And it usually has something to do with whether or not someone's trying to, use the shibboleth, like they're trying to, be, what's his name, Tangelo Grosso. He called into the XP when I was on there, and he likes to pretend as though he understands the science. He likes to pretend as though he's actually read stuff, and you could tell instantly that he hasn't. And so when I then kind of switch modes and go, okay, hey, let's actually talk about these particular molecules that catalyze their own reactions, and talk about stuff like ribozymes, and then he's kind of whoa, he rears back a bit, because then now we're getting into the territory where I stopped treating you with kid gloves, and I started treating you like a big boy, and a lot of people don't want to be put in that situation, but they would like to put on airs and kind of pretend they know more than they really do, and that's kind of part of the showboat aspect of having these live discussions, because it's easy to just flippantly make statements, have these claims, but it's harder to actually defend them in real time, and especially when you're kind of put on the spot and forced to defend things, because now there's a record of that screw up. And so if you're more concerned with your appearance than whether or not you're actually right or wrong, then which choice people will more than likely make.
Well, and I want to backtrack a little bit to a comment that you made at the beginning of that, which was about it being sort of a lack of introspection. I think that a lot of people can come to the conclusion that they're wrong, but I think a lot of people have ingrained their beliefs or even some of their past behavior so deeply into their identity that even if they come to the conclusion that they've been wrong, even if they no longer outwardly express those opinions because they realize they've been wrong, actually actively coming out like Knock just did and saying I was wrong has a major blow to the ego and to that appearance, like you were talking about. So people can change, but most people change quietly. They don't change outwardly and flamboyantly and loudly unless they believe there's something to gain. They change quietly and internally and just stop talking about that thing or start talking about it slightly differently rather than outright saying I done fucked up, mate.
Yeah, well see,
the issue with that, the issue with that is that because some people will hold positions that they feel are morally justified, and the politics is a good example that Knock brought up. That if you hold to a political position that you think is morally superior to an opposite position, that you become invested in this. That that you're right. You're no longer just a someone who's trying to push others to think in this way, but you become almost on a mission to do so. Because you might believe that you have have a moral responsibility, and you get this a lot, especially within politics. So when something comes out and you realize that your logic on something might be wrong, or you realize that just like, oh shoot, I might have made an error here, people get afraid that that this is going to affect their conclusion. And this is a good example, because people will have that conclusion. They believe that doing action X is the most moral action out there. Now all I got to do is explain and argue for that action. But think about this. This is exactly the same thing that you have like a lot of people, like especially in the theistic debates, do as well. Is that they have their conclusion and now they want to build up their argument towards it instead of building up an argument and trying just following it where the conclusion will lie. And now, like I said, this is an introspection. We don't let people get away with this in some topics, but it becomes the backbone of how we form some of our arguments when it comes to things like politics.
Oh yeah, it's in my interactions with most people, like lefties or righties, or I call them lefties, but I'm mainly speaking about moderates in the Democratic Party. They don't understand why they think a thing. They don't understand the policy behind the things that they want to achieve. They only understand the talking points that they've heard. They're for
A
universal
really
health
good
care.
example, like a really good example of this is actually universal healthcare. There's a lot of people that
Yeah.
understand that they want it and they understand what they think the benefits are, but when you actually start talking, okay, so what's the policy going to look like? And
Hmm.
keep in mind, I'm a supporter of universal healthcare, but I've also, got friends and family who live in countries where it exists. So I kind of understand some of what the taxation looks like, what the other policies that got put into place in order to support it, things like bans on junk food, or rather less bans but regulations on junk food. You go to Europe and certain soda has significantly lower sugar content because there are laws about that. There are laws about advertising. There
Hmm.
are various laws in Canada about advertising to minors for certain kinds of products. So there's an entire infrastructure and ecosystem that surrounds universal healthcare, but most people, when they talk about it, they only talk about how it's right and how healthcare is a human right. They talk about the moral talking points. They don't talk about the policy.
Yeah, well, that was going to be my example. Yeah, they don't understand so if you're going to have a political discussion on universal health care, you should understand the policy behind it, as you're saying. But most importantly, you should be able to explain how it's going to be paid for, because that's going to be the main gist of that discussion. And if you don't understand how that's going to happen, they're going to tear you apart. And too often that happens. They just don't understand how it's going to be paid for because they haven't truly looked into it. And yeah, so they end up getting torn apart, and the conservative wins the narrative.
Starting to dislike that word narrative.
Yeah.
It's yeah, that it is. It is interesting that, and I definitely agree that I see that a lot in political discussions. I get a lot of my political information from my buddy Xavier because he's more kind of tuned in on that end of the spectrum, and so he and I will actually discuss political topics over lunch and kind of what's going on with Iran and other things, but as well as trying to vet people who you agree with, because that doesn't really seem to happen often, and I don't think that's something that's unique to any one political party or ideology or what have you. It's just uh, there are people who have different focuses in life. Obviously,
Hmm.
there are folks who value different things, and so you get the people who value very similar things, and you could toss a label on them. Here we go. We're the people who believe in the thing. But when it comes to everyone believing in the thing or wanting the thing, how we all go about it differs greatly, and so then it becomes a game of, okay, well, how do we go about obtaining the thing the most efficacious way possible? So that is always an interesting question,
Hmm.
because the people
Sorry,
who
my border just decided to photobomb you guys.
oh, that's all right. So
My
it's so it's so for me, I understand that I'd like to leave emotions out of things, and so when I hear people who want to go after the thing, come with kind of emotional arguments, and say, okay, cool, I get how you viscerally feel, and I see people kind of make the mistake of, um, you know, let's leave emotion out of it. You can't necessarily do that. You can't leave emotions completely out of a topic, especially one that impacts people's lives. But you can't also let that be the crux into which you are going to kind of
Hmm.
rest your desire upon. Because if we're if we want to go about this the most efficacious way, and that's presuming a lot, then we need to be cognizant of the emotional aspect or the emotional toll that whatever it is takes, but understand the mechanics of it. And so once we break down, and this can fit a lot of scenarios, um, when you are going at the thing, how does that impact other people? And that's something that gets overlooked from any
Yeah.
political perspective.
Well, I think that there's also an important thing to make. I wanted to address something else that you said. You can't take emotion fully out of it. There have been other studies that have shown that humans lose the ability to prioritize and make decisions when they don't have access to the emotional parts of their brains. There's been a couple of interesting things that I've read on that. Now, I haven't read the papers themselves, I'll admit that. I've read a number of articles on them, but I have gone and looked a little bit at some of the theory behind it. And yeah, it does make a lot of sense that to a certain degree, your emotional response is part of what drives you to make the decisions that you make, to hold the positions that you hold. It shouldn't be the number one, but it's nearly impossible to function without it.
Okay, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's so there's uh, a an ethical theory out there called ideal observer theory, um, which views ethics as not as a not as this objective thing, but still as a universal thing. Is that the ethics gets defined by the actions of what they call this ideal observer, this ultimate judge. And they say that something is defined as being ethical or not by virtue of that it would be done by this ideal observer. And then you have to define what the characteristics of this ideal observer are. And generally, it's like omnipotent in all things except for moral facts, unbiased is one of them, and there's a few others. But the unbiased one is always an interesting one. And I think it was Ocean and I that had this conversation, and that I've thought about this. And it brings like what you're talking about here, that without biases, without that the value system that drives you, could you ever take action on anything? Like, could you ever be
I remember you
motivated
talked to
do
Cirrus
it?
a little bit about it too, because that was the second part to the Search for the Golden Mean stream, and you talked to Cirrus a bit about that too.
Yeah, might have been there. I know it comes up. It's a standard objection to ideal observer theory, but it does come into play when we talk about whether or not something that is free of biases could actually take action to do anything.
Yeah, like speaking to the emotion thing, like I think that there's a fine balance. Like I think that one of my main goals this year is to have a firmer control on my emotional reactions. Because another thing that I saw in myself as I was doing my year in review, watching a lot of those old streams back, and a lot of it was probably the alcohol. I'm not gonna lie, but just my emotional reactions when in certain situations of intense drama, like when Aaron Ford flipped out and wouldn't talk to Chris because Chris was wearing lipstick, or when the Black Hebrew Israelite started calling me a $5 Indian and I booted him out. Like I need to have a firmer grasp on my emotional responses because those could have really ended up actually turning into better conversations had I allowed them. They might have turned into worse shitstorms, who knows? But had I not had that reaction, that visceral reaction, then I think that those conversations, those two specific conversations in themselves would have been a lot better, especially
It's like
the rabbi. And real
it's
quick,
like oh, sorry, go ahead.
just before I lose it, $2 from Von Hilton's children. Can we get a shout out to the Kentucky CPS?
Oh, jeez. I like Von Hilton's children, but um, that emotional maturity, and I don't like describing it that way, just because it feels like some people are just deficient on it, and I don't think that there's anything necessarily wrong with someone, having emotions. like I'm not endorsing Vulcans here or anything. But you
Well,
definitely
I
do
mean, as
see
a
it,
stoic,
like um,
as a
like Shan-
stoic and somebody who's been through cognitive behavioral therapy, it's less the emotion itself, which you can't always control the initial emotion you feel, but what you can do is you can control your narrative about it and how you respond to it.
right, and like this is a good example. Like if you want a good example of someone who can really just you know just uh, just go forward and just not get overly emotional. Um, like just watch Shannon Q's discussion with Dee Dee yesterday.
Yeah. Oh
Like
yeah. I'm
that was
glad that you
brilliant.
both.
You have
Drag. Did you see it too?
I saw I watched I tuned in for the last half of it, and from
Oh
what I
man, it was
understand,
beautiful.
the last half of it is when it got kind of the conversation. Like, by that point in time, Dee Dee was tamed, you know, uh,
Yeah,
by uh, by
he was
Shannon.
in a froth.
Yeah, so it was, like that's a good example, like just of I've known dozens of people that have had conversations with Dee Dee, and it gets with a lot of people it gets really heated because he's an aggravating person to talk to. He doesn't listen. He has his script. You have to answer the questions in the way that he wants them. And if you go off it at all, he'll sit there and he'll just try to he'll
He'll
start
throw
doing this
fucking
weird-
insults at you. Like,
Yeah.
Knock put up a 5-minute video of me putting him in his place in the Discord. Like, he tried to pull that crap with me. And when I refused to, deal with his rephrasings and stuff, he called me hysterical. And as a moderator, I muted him and I told him that the other two people that were talking, he was going to let them finish and then he could respond to them. And he fucking left because he just could not handle, not being able to, train, like, I guess, railroad everyone into his script.
Yeah, I've never seen James mute people like that before, and like after the first time, I was like, if James does that again, Darth is out of here, and he stayed through it. I was surprised. I'll give him credit for that, but he got his ass kicked. It was beautiful.
Yeah, and it's it is funny, like with DD, is that like you want to talk about like emotionally unstable.
Mm-hmm.
Like the amount of blow-ups that you could find online from discussions that he's had where he's just swearing and losing it at people. Like, yeah.
My favorite so far is
him.
when he told the atheist, like you're the type of person that you have your family over on Thanksgiving and they show up and you don't have any turkey. He was talking to me.
Was that supposed to be an insult?
Yeah. It was like it. I don't know. It was hilarious. I think he was just so fucking pissed. He was just shit was coming out of his mouth.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. He talks about people's family life, given what we know about him. But yeah, no, he is probably one of the most unstable people I have encountered, and my litmus for that is G-Man, obviously. But even G-Man has family members that still tolerate him. DD doesn't. So keep that in mind. Think about how unsufferable of a person, how miserable you have to be, and that's kind of always what's in the back of my head. Even it shouldn't be. To be fair, I shouldn't actually think very little of the people I talk to, but it is something that I frequently laugh about as I'm going to sleep, because some of them genuinely stay awake at night, concerned with how people view them on the internet. And I can tell you, I don't lose a bit of sleep over anybody's depiction of me, whether for better or worse. The people who know me, aren't really impressed by any of the shenanigans, and like I don't have a supporting family, which most people do. People have challenges, but and maybe certain strife here and there. But like some people honestly come to this platform and they are just absolutely trying to escape their real life, and Didi is one of them, unfortunately. And so he believes that he can take it out on people and really take it out on women. And I have no problem pointing that out. Just take a look at some of the insults he gives women specifically, and you'll see that there's a certain level of disdain that he has for them, which would make sense given his current relationship status. So it's sad. It's something that you have to kind of rest from your brain in order to have at least somewhat of a decent conversation, if that's what you truly want. But more and more I kind of see myself going the Aussie route and just saying, you know what, there are just certain people who and I'm paraphrasing, aren't worth speaking to, and Didi is just certainly one of them. I mean, if James thinks that there's something that can be gained from having Didi abuse people on his platform, then so be it. But I make no illusions about what I do on my channel. It's for entertainment. You're not going to learn
Oh,
anything from G-Man.
The person who came in, are they coming back?
Oh, I lost him, and I'm starting to redo everything. I'll just do a one window until they get in for good, and then I'll adjust everything. So give me a second.
Yeah,
Drag, you're the only face on the channel currently.
Oh, hello, folks. How are y'all doing? See the top of my head there? I can. If you want to see something real fun, I can screen share my other screen here. Oh wow! They've changed this platform a lot.
Give me a second.
There we go. And see me play 7 Days of Die. I don't even know why I like this game. I have no idea why. So it looks like Adventus Hermes has joined us. Yeah, Adventus Hermes is one of those. He doesn't fall in that group of people. By the way, I actually had him recently on the Magic Sandwich Show. He spoke to Alex Malpass, and they were discussing the the Grim Reaper paradox and the Kalam cosmological argument, and kind of the implications for uh, you know the concept of infinity, right? So I think it's interesting, given what some people put forth as their, I guess, perspective on whether or not things have always existed, and whether there has been a persistence, a persistent universe,
Oh, we've
or
got Justin Wilson back. Also, we have a super chat from Saxy Calzone. Dee Dee's ultimate sin is that he pretends that he doesn't know that he's actively a prick.
he knows.
Can anyone
Oh
hear
yeah,
me?
he definitely knows. I think he
Yeah.
thrives on
Yeah, we
it.
can hear you.
Okay. I'll just figure this out. So now I can hear you guys for the first time. So
Okay, I was giving you praise, Justin.
about
Oh, your demeanor overall. You and I have exchanged words quite a few times over the years, different platforms, and so I don't find you to be somebody of that's scornful or anything of that nature. I actually enjoy our conversations.
cool. Praise God.
Yeah, there we
So
go. We got him on the stream. I need to actually look at the stream. Surprised he has this. People like Justin's camera and his background. Like that's like they people like it. I don't think anyone actually remembers some of the stuff that he says. But man, let the cat walk by, or people look at his background, or who
I'm
he has on the
fixing
back
everything
wall.
right now. But we have his avatar, I believe.
yeah, I don't have my computer set up, so
Okay, that's fair enough. Is that a green screen back there? What is that projected on your back wall?
it's a projector.
It is a projector.
Yeah,
You just
yeah.
you just have that going all the time.
Yeah, I mean that's why that's why I watch Netflix and chill and rack. Yeah, just yeah.
You have a mirror up on the roof, up on the ceiling.
No.
No, okay. I was just curious. You know why I asked you.
Why?
So, I'll tell you later.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
All
I'm
right, I think
sorry, I
that'll
missed
work.
most of what you guys were talking about, but catch me up to speed to the most interesting part.
Yeah. So we were talking about having discussions with people, right? And kind of the people. Some people are just kind of insufferable, while others, are kind of more of a delight to discuss things with. And I had brought up your recent discussion with Alex Malpass, which, did you enjoy it? At least you seem to.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, there was some other thoughts that I really wanted to bring to him. Um I just when you have a conversation, you just don't know how the flow is going to be.
Hmm.
So yeah, I wish I knew the flow, because that would have brought some more objections and questions. Not that his ideas was wrong, like unreasonable. It's just that just it was thought provoking.
Yeah.
It's
And
also like a really obscure paradox. Like that's the other issue I had. It's like I think I'd heard of it before when Drake was kind of pitching the idea, and I remember like thinking about it. It's like I had to look up, and it actually wasn't the first one that I thought of. But when I was kind of reading about it, it was like, okay, I have heard this, but like, man, this is something that this is a discussion that I've is not often had. Like, you don't see a lot of people bringing up that particular paradox in response to the Kalam.
Well, one thought I brought up after we came off the broadcast was the fact that if every moment has an infinite, I guess, division within itself, so technically you can't get to the next moment, then everything, I mean, if you can calculate it, everything would be technically a black hole. Um, and then therefore everything would cancel itself out. Then there would be no existence of anything.
I'm not sure if that's the result of having an infinite set of events within every particular, like, let's say if there's an infinite series within each second. I'm not sure if that would result in some type of obliteration scenario, because you could infinitely divide any time period, any conceivable thing. But that's just dividing something, right?
Dragnaught, I just wanted to
Yeah.
interrupt really quick to say welcome to the discussion, Otangelo.
Yeah. It's just one thing. Yeah, like Justin, if you take a look at it, like you've heard the thing like the somebody crossing a room and they move half of the remaining distance of the room every second. How long is it going to take them to get to the end of the room? And when you realize that when you constantly just divide by half, is that you have this infinite number in there that they'll never get to the end of the room. That's what they'll propose, because you get down to that point where it's like you're splitting atoms to try to maintain that last distance, but you're never going to get to the whole number. You're never going to complete it if you constantly just keep on dividing it by half. But that's different than like an infinite amount of moments within like a single unit is a little bit different to look at. Is that while we can't really conceptualize what it means for there to be an infinite amount of moments, we know that between let's take a look at something like a second. Inside of 1 second, there could be an infinite amount of moments. But if we add all those moments together, we know that it equals to 1, because we've already defined it this way, that 1 second contains an infinite amount of moments. And this is where it gets complex to understand, is that it's not that you can never get to the next moment. You can. It's just that trying to understand what it means for an infinite amount of something to equal 1 unit of something.
Yeah, so basically you're just saying 1 infinity, two infinity, 3 infinity, but it's like you're using a cheat code, and like, is this a logical leap to get to 1 and then 2 and then 3? Because there's no bridge. Because every time you try to make a bridge, the bridge doesn't reach to the other end.
Well, that's only, like I said, that's only happens if you do the dividing by half thing. Not if you look at it as a complete set. So there's a complete set of something, which is equal 1 unit. And there could be an infinite amount of things in that set, but infinite amount in that case equals 1. It's the difference between, it's the same thing if we're counting. Like, you can count from 1 to 2 and never reach 2. You can spend an entire lifetime doing it, because it's breaking this down into like extreme decimal places here. But that doesn't mean that you could never get to 2. Just because an infinite amount of possible numbers exist between 1 and 2 doesn't mean that you never get to 2.
Yeah, see, and that's the thing. Well, the moment you said the complete set, how do we complete it?
Well, if
How do
you
you complete
bracketed
it?
everything together, but it's like
Everything?
it's hard to really kind of understand. Like this is the problem dealing with infinite just in general.
I mean, yeah.
That's some deep shit, Socka.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm listening. I'm trying to help Tangelo get his sound working. He's new to Zoom. So there is. I'm trying to follow and remember what Justin just said. So.
I mean, my only response to that is that infinity, by its nature, given that we are finite beings, is nearly intangible. Like, it's nearly impossible to grasp infinity, but that doesn't mean that you can't understand the concept cognitively to a certain degree. Like, you may not be able to fully imagine infinity, but you can understand what the definition of infinity is.
True. Yeah, we can define it. Like, we can actually work. There's mathematics when you do entry level calculus. You work with infinities all the time. There's different rules on how you can actually divide by infinity. You can actually do equations with infinity. We know how to operate within it, but when we're trying to, like Aliakai was saying, like when we try to conceptualize it, it's hard for us to imagine, because we have to then think about, well, what does infinity mean to a mortal man or woman? Is it just an infinite number of days, minutes? What does that actually mean? What is that in relation to? And so that's where we kind of get bogged down in the mechanics of how something like that would actually exist.
Well, okay, when it comes to numbers, that's one thing. Those are just concepts. But then when it comes to time, isn't it not a thing? Like, isn't one moment completely different from the next moment? So, And if it's attached to like space and the universe, then how do we complete one moment to get to the next moment? I mean, we could use a cheat code in our brains and just not deal with it and just go to the next, just fast forward to the next moment. Um, but like, how does time actually move from one moment to the next moment? It's like in a black hole of infinite division.
So
I mean, there's at least one school of science that states that we don't actually get to two, we just perceive time linearly, even though it doesn't seem to operate that way.
Well, there's still moments in our brain that's perceiving.
Hello.
okay, Tangelo, you're silent, you're low, but we can hear you. So now there. So let me try my best to explain. So
Better now?
no, it's still very very low.
Hmm. I don't
So
know how to.
there's a span of time. There's 5 minutes, right? Conceptually, if we're talking about the Grim Reaper paradox, um, we can split that time because we've arbitrarily created, this metric for how we measure the passage of time, or what we consider to be the passage of time. And from that, there's nothing saying that we can't split that up into any more divisions. We can split the hours into minutes, and then the minutes into seconds, and then what's stopping us from splitting the seconds into even smaller fractions? And then from there, we could technically infinitely separate each new segment that we create. Now, I think your question is then how do we get from one time period to another if it is indeed infinite? Well, that's kind of the fun part here, right? When we start talking about that in reference to the Grim Reaper paradox, that's the issue, is that if you are going to assert that there is some type of progression from the very first point in time, that mover, or there's a name for it, that prime mover, right? How do we establish such a thing, given that there's this passage of time within this realm that's really kind of undefined? Like I'm doing a poor job of trying to explain it here, but that's kind of like what we were playing with as far as the idea of which Grim Reaper in an infinite set is going to do something, because in either direction, actually previously, like there are infinite Grim Reapers, that there is a stop point presumably in the one variation of it, that one Grim Reaper at like a minute after midnight, that one is going to kill him no matter what. But then you have all that time preceding it, so um, that's that's kind of what boggles my mind. And I'm not going to pretend as though I understand all of it, but at least that aspect of it, I do get. And I'm going to have to talk to Dr. Malpass to fully comprehend what's going on.
Yeah, I just think that at the end of um, our conclusions, like there's going to be only two conclusions. Either there's a ground to time, like there's a point where you can't divide it no more, and that's where everything starts, or you're just going to keep on going down in division of time. And yeah, if you go to the whole division of time infinitely, then yes, I think you're just stuck with not making sense of going forward. But for me, I'm just going to assume that there has to be a indivisible point of a beginning where, I don't know, the extreme nanoseconds of seconds, um, like actually cannot be divisible. And I mean, essentially, there's a constant beginning in every moment that's happening. So time is not infinite um, in this universe. Like as far as infinite, as far as backwards or divisible, divisibly, divisibility or divisible. Well, the divisibleness. Sorry, let me just give it up on that
The
word.
divisibility.
Yeah, the divisibility does not extend for eternity or just infinitely when it comes to time. That's my belief. because I don't see how we can move without there being a ground. How do you jump without a ground?
I think I see what you're saying. I want to say it may be related to one of the objections that Dr. Malpass wrote about. I call it Erasmus objection, where the first objection comes in there's let's see, there's two principles. I just pulled it up. He says that Cohen's version of the Grim Reaper paradox requires the following two principles. It is possible for God to predetermine an endless future, and it is possible for God to actualize an ungrounded causal chain. And he defines the causal chain is one that lacks a first cause. So the behavior of the reaper at time zero is determined by, or is grounded by, the behavior of the reapers that are in its future, but the behavior of the reapers in its future, such that the one at T1, that one that is T1, that's after the initial, are themselves determined or grounded in the behavior of the reapers in the future of themselves. So after that initial T0 reaper, things kind of become a bit loopy because he is because they are grounded by the behavior of any of the ones in front of them.
Do you know a blue drag? Because I think they're trying to get in. I'm not sure though.
Which blue?
I think it's Stabby Blue. Let me see. Yeah, it's Stabby Blue.
Yeah, we know him. He's cool.
Yeah, I just looked in there. Yeah. I don't know if Blue's going to behave.
I think that there's a challenge, though, here when you're talking about how exactly do you define time? Because the simplest definition of time that I've actually come across, like the progression of events from blah, blah, blah into the future, right? That means that time is effectively a measure of change. So if there were a beginning, it would be the very first change to the, stable state that preceded the Big Bang.
Well, that's why they say that time is a measure of matter and motion, right? So no matter, no motion, no time. Yeah, that's the way that they kind of look at it now. So, for example, like if everything in the universe just dropped down to absolute zero and all matter just stopped moving, everything just stopped moving, then that would be, I guess, time stopped. So it could sit like that for a duration for, it doesn't make sense to talk about how long was everything stopped for, because there wouldn't be a way to measure that.
Yeah. Let's see if Otangelo can actually get in, because I think he was trying to.
Yes, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, you're low, but I can hear you. I'm sure you're come through.
I don't know how to put the volume higher so you guys can hear me better. I don't know how. It's already on the max volume.
I can hear you.
Speak louder into the microphone.
Maybe if I put it closer to my mouth.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just getting into the discussion of you guys, and for what I understood, you tried to figure out how could there be existence without time. Is that correct?
Well, what we were just discussing was a previous hangout that we had with a philosopher on a pretty obscure topic, honestly, and it's kind of hard to catch people up given its depth. So it may actually just be best that we kind of just forego this particular topic, given its complexity, and that very few of us in here can actually articulate it very well.
I'm high enough to enjoy it. I know some of the chats like I'm not high enough. I am definitely high. Like, man, yeah, this is some high shit.
It is certainly a question which I have thought about, how God could exist beyond the universe without time. And I've come with an explanation which is mine. Maybe it's not rational, I don't know. but at least I can grasp how it eventually could be possible.
Hmm.
Go ahead. I'd like to hear your theory. I have one. I have a theory as well.
Okay, so I thought about this. When I go to sleep and I wake up in the morning, then I cannot say how many hours of sleep I had, and I do not perceive time, but I have sequential uh, events in dreams which I can actually be the actor. Okay, can you follow me on that?
So
Yeah, so far.
So I can imagine that God eventually was living in a dimension without space and matter and without time, but having mental experiences, sequential experiences, and without experiencing time. If I can have that without time in a dream, then I can imagine that God can have that too beyond the universe.
Well, I think that part of
So
here's part of where I get tripped up here is, if you define time similarly to the way that we just did when I spoke with Drag a second ago, that time is effectively a measure of change. It's matter in motion, as Sokka pointed out. Then a timeless being would be an unchanging being, and an unchanging being would be unable to act. So, how could God have brought the universe into existence if he is unchanging and therefore unable to act? Because an action
Well,
is a change.
I
that is also a question which William Craig gave a reply, an answer to that, and I can read it to you. So basically, what he is saying is that the action, the cause and the effect, they occur simultaneously.
no, it doesn't change. That doesn't solve the problem.
It
It
doesn't
does.
solve the
yeah,
problem. Like any sort of mental
because that would
activity
be
is still an
positing.
action.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that'd be positing that God is always in a state of creating. He's always like, so. Take a look at every single act that God does in the Bible, and then in order for that to be true, that at every moment God has to be doing that act, like every moment that exists for God. See what gets positive sometimes is that.
But then again, once a moment exists, an action has been taken, and therefore, again,
Yeah,
that God is still no longer unchanging. That God would be unable to do anything whatsoever because that would be a change of state. Effectively, the only way that a timeless God could exist would be during heat death because there would be absolutely no change.
No.
the
Well, I,
the issue with well, with a lot of these things when you get into these ideas, and this is why I feel like it turns into a lot of special pleading when they start to positing like God and start describing it in this sense, is even to the examples you give of you dreaming, is that the reason why that you know that a certain duration of time has gone by between the time that you go to sleep and the time that you wake up is because the universe is still spinning. That's how you measure it. That's how you know that that stuff's happening. So that when you wake up and you know that a passage of time has happened, it's just in respect to the fact that matter has still been in motion while you weren't doing anything. But when you to take a look at God, that especially if you just describe him in such a way that he's not contingent on anything, um, and I'll come back to that point. Is that you would have to measure time in some sort of meta time. That instead of time being a measure of matter in motion, time becomes a measure of God's actions. So every single moment that's separated is separated by each action that God does, which means that when God is not acting, that God, that there is no meta time moving at that point. Um, but the issue with something like that as well is I'm trying to understand that what any type of antecedent conditions would come into play to cause a God to act and to do something instead of something else. So if God is an infinite being, for example, he had this entire infinity of him not creating, then all of a sudden he decided to create. And when he created, what was the reason that at that moment, that at that point he decided that this is the time that's appropriate to create, and that without any type of any type of stimulus acting on it, without any type of outside influence that's influencing decision, um, that it seems relatively arbitrary that you could just pick a single moment and say, well, this is the time that they decide to act. It could have been any time, in that. And so when you have when you take a look at that, if there's a infinite time where God did not create the universe, and with no with no reason that God is contingent on for creating the universe, that God would never create the universe. There would never be a reason to. No, nothing that's affecting that choice. That no antecedent decision to get to that point where they decide to create.
Well, and not only that, but how would you define a reason at all in that sort of state? Because apologies, my accent's coming out. I just noticed that. But when you talk about any sort of cognitive capability that you have to make a decision, every decision you make to some degree is precipitated, or I guess predicated on the knowledge of time. You have a finite amount of time and you understand that. You don't know how much time you have, but you only have a finite amount of time. And so each and every decision that you as a mortal being make is in some way linked to that fact. Priorities only can exist when you have a finite amount of time to work with. Otherwise, if you have infinite amounts of time, there would be absolutely no reason to do one thing over any other thing. So trying to create any sort of logical system for why a being that is timeless, infinite, and immortal would do anything is nearly impossible.
Well, I have a paradigm I call the divine time paradigm, where, of course, I divide the experience of time for God and the experience of time for, I guess, the universe, with this wall, this unsolvable wall that's going to be there. So the difference between timelessness and time, that wall cannot be penetrated. You cannot explain it at all. You can't say that at one time in timelessness, God decided to do something in time. It doesn't. It just can't work, because then you create moments in timelessness. So you have to assume that in that timeless realm, um, it goes by its own rules, and that universe does not mesh with our universe perfectly at all. So in the timeless realm that God exists, there's also time. Um, so the way I look at it is that there is like layers upon layers upon layers upon layers of time, but eventually, as you go up higher in the layer, each layer would somehow like have all the time that's below it, and eventually, once you get to the top, you're going to be at a point of how do you say, singularity, where all time, past, present, and future, is all one moment, and nothing changes, nothing moves, because everything is now. But below that, the
I
regression
don't
starts.
I don't see how that would be possible though, because again, if you define time by change, and if you try to change the definition of time, at that point you basically are special pleading.
Well,
If
of
you
course,
Well,
define
it's such a sad. Like I covered this to kind of I kind of brought this up where the if God, if there exists a time that God is subject to, like what's one of the things that you're kind of proposing here, that
then
there's an
he's still
aspect
not
of,
timeless.
there's he's not timeless, and there's an aspect of reality which is beyond his control or her control. And if that's the case, that there exists something that God is not in control of, that God exists contingently to, that then you can just push back the question. Any type of assertion that God is necessary for anything can be brought into question, because there does exist now something that God is not necessary for to exist. Which is why I said that when we talk about the meta time, that some people would propose to overcome this problem by measuring, this meta time in only in relation to God's actions. You could try to do that, but then that's when you brought up the other problem with that, which is that you can never get to a point where God could act.
Well, yeah, because again, like the point that I brought up, the concept of motivation and reason don't exist without time.
Well, Craig, he explains it in that way. He says that God exists beyond time, in a timeless dimension, and at the moment when he decides to create the universe, he enters time together.
So
The
God
problem
takes
is, though, you still keep like coming back to a decision, a change. Change defines time. So timeless being cannot be timeless if there is a change.
Right. That's a huge issue. The second something is done, that means time has passed, right? Because I'm not sure of a scenario where you can do something but no time passes, right? That doesn't make any sense. So you can't both assert that he is immune from time, he is immutable in that aspect, but then also can take action which would require time by necessity.
The closest that you could possibly come is to say that humans are unable to perceive the length of time that that being has existed, but that does not make the being timeless. It just makes us incapable of cognitively grasping infinity effectively, or however close this being gets to it. That it's very different, between you can't understand it fully because you are a finite being, to this thing can actually exist fully without time, outside of time. I don't even hold that my gods exist outside of time.
Well, okay, so let's say let's say we were inside a computer world or like a video, like a movie, right? And the person who is outside the movie has the control to fast forward and, rewind. Now we can say that he's outside of time, or at least our time, but to us, he's timeless because he extends throughout all time in our world. But to himself, he could be timeless and also temporal. So he experiences that as well. The fact that he is greater than himself.
Being able to experience time non-linearly is not the same as being outside of it.
What do you mean?
Because he's still subject to time. Like that's like it's relative, right? So the scenario that you just brought up shows that there's a different there's a different span of time, there's a different perception of time, but that doesn't mean that there is no time, right? There's a difference between something being absent and being altered.
I think at the moment that you can have a dream where you don't experience time, you have evidence that it is possible. And
Yeah.
when you dream, for example, and you have a nightmare, what do? You try to wake up, you take action. And so I see a parallel to God, which can exist in a timeless dimension, not experiencing time, but uh, taking action actually, and bringing the universe into existence through a decision.
Yeah, and that example, time still passes though. Like not perceiving it is not the same thing as it not happening.
Well, in our case,
and actually
of
not
course,
perceiving
time.
it. Oh, Tangelo, I wanted to build on that for a second, because your example of sleeping and waking up and not perceiving how many hours have passed, those hours have still passed. The changes biologically that are going to happen in your cells and in all
Yeah.
of the atoms that make up everything around you have still happened, even though your consciousness is currently put away. Time still affects you, even if you don't perceive it. So the idea of God sort of being in a similar state where he's dreaming still doesn't mean he's not subject to time. It simply means he can no longer perceive time as it passes.
Well, I see time bound to space and matter. But when you dream, you don't perceive space and matter in the same way as when you are wake up.
Okay, so if I don't perceive my house being infested by roaches, does that mean that I'm not getting an infestation?
Well, the difference is that, okay, we are living in a physical environment, and when I dream, I am still in my body, and time continues to pass. But I am talking only about my perception. I can have an existence, we and having thoughts without perceiving time, and I can imagine that God could exist in such a dimension too.
Okay, and I think we're still not, I guess, determining the difference between something being a perspective of something versus something actually being the case. Like, right, perception isn't necessarily reality. And I think that's like the most succinct way that I can explain it
Well,
because I could
my
postulate,
dreams are real. When I
okay,
dream and I wake up, then I remember sometimes what I dreamed about. So they are very real. They are not
okay,
an illusion.
Right, but in your analogy here, right, there's not the passage of time because it's not perceived, right? That's that
Yes,
being the
yes.
crux of it. But we know that time passes.
Well, and
Time
on top of
passes, but
it,
not in my perception, because while I am dreaming, I am not wake up. I don't
okay, but like
experience the physical.
physiologically speaking, though, what you recognize as you, and I'm going to get into some of these are going to be accurate terms. A lot of them will not be. I use a lot of my own personal vocabulary for this. Drag, if you want to pop in and let me know when I screw up psychological terms, I'd really appreciate it. But what you perceive as you is actually just one portion of your brain. I tend to refer to it as the internal narrator. It's a function of the prefrontal cortex along with language centers of the brain and other things. So that internal narrator is only a portion of your physical self, and your physical self is you. I know that you're probably a dualist because you're Christian, but
Yes.
regardless, your physical body and the electrical firings and hormones and, neurochemical messengers that we know constitute dreams, those dreams you remember, and even the very function of remembering, they are all physiological processes, including your narrator telling you what it thinks about those dreams. We're going to separate the bits of the self, even though that's not really how it works. All of that is physical. And that physical entity, those atoms, were still moving, meaning time was still passing, even though the internal narrator did not have the functioning equipment to perceive it. Your lack of perception does not stop the fact that all of those processes are what brought about what limited perception you had. Your body still experienced time, aging, cellular respiration, cellular, and like all of those processes and every single chemical reaction within you still occurred during that period of time. If you would have died, all of the, cells that are currently inhabiting your body that are not your own would begin consuming you. Like your perception, your lack of perception of your death potentially, if you were to die during your sleep, would not stop that change from occurring.
Yeah, I
Well,
actually
that
studied
is
a little bit about this when I was researching my grandfather's Alzheimer's. Sleep is actually very essential to the brain because it's when you're sleeping, the brain functions slower and cleanses the toxins out of itself. So yeah, the body is still experiencing time, even if the mind, the subconscious, is doing its whatever it's doing. I've never actually understood dreams. Dreams are a mystery to me.
Well, that is of
I
course a completely different matter about dualism. If our thoughts are just a function of the brain, or if it's separate and so on, that would give a long discussion with elucidating near-death experiences, if they're real, if they are just an illusion, and so forth. So I don't think you guys want to scratch that now.
What were you saying, Soccer?
no, I was gonna agree with Knock. Is that I remember reading about the first page of a paper on dreams, and that was about as far as I made it before. It's like, nope, too much. Like, I don't.
Yeah.
This is beyond me. I'm going to keep the psychology stuff out of here because I'm just not good at it.
Well, the problem though is that when you're arguing from a point of view of psychology, when you're using yourself as an example and postulating that this could happen to a deity, you're ignoring the very physical process and trying to project this idea of the self as being somehow separate from that. And again, you're right, Otangelo. In order to justify that claim, you would actually have to start digging into how the separation between the mind, the nerves, the body, and the soul would work. But it's still the, even if you were trying to use it as an illustrative example, you'd have to start digging into how that would work for a deity. In order for a deity to have a thought or a dream, the thought or dream itself would be a change. The cognitive process would be a change. It would be in some way physical in order for that being to exist. So that being would still not be timeless.
Well,
Yeah, but
that
see, here's
is
the thing that can I add? The concept of infinity, we believe infinity exists, right? So if there's an infinite regression all the way, and we just assume that there is a top, and the top has this infinite ceiling, once you get past a certain infinite point, and then beyond that point is infinite, you have a God who's infinitely everywhere. And then also you have your cake and you can eat it as well, because once you have
Okay,
infinity,
so wait, slow down a little bit, backtrack a little bit. How does infinite movement lead to omnipresence? Those two are not the same thing.
well, I didn't say infinite movement. I just said the concept of infinity. So the idea of a being who can be infinitely anywhere in all places at all times.
Okay,
You
well,
could,
that again, you're talking about omnipresence. You're not talking specifically about an infinite being. An omnipresent being could be not infinite.
well, omnitemporal, because if we're considering, for example, space time has, of course, time that is connected to gravity. So not every part of the universe is experiencing time or going through
All
time
right,
the same
Dragnaut, I'm
way.
going to let you have that one because, like, I'm not even going to dig into this. I have had enough of this particular segment. I'm gonna let you have that one because I know it's wrong, and I'm pretty sure I know the ways in which it's wrong. But I'm pretty sure you could express it better than me.
What space time is? Did I say something wrong about space time? Or warping of gravity, time and gravity is not
No,
affect gravity
I'm
doesn't
I'm
affect.
not really sure if gravity is really a big, like if unless we're talking about like the funky stuff that happens near black holes, like or super dense masses. But um the so we're talking about, we're trying to like
I mean,
gel.
for one thing, motion and gravity are not the same thing.
Right, yeah, that's just I'm trying to get this down like to bare bones, because I think we're throwing, there's a pot and we're just throwing stuff in it. um like we're trying to take aspects of the known universe, and then we're trying to offer them and impart as attributes to an entity without a substrate, which is interesting because the very things that we're talking about here do actually have substrates. Like they're things, they're fields that give things mass, right? So
They're physical in the sense that we could perceive things as physical.
right. Yeah. So they're not perceivable in the same way that, maybe condensation is on a window, but they do actually exist. So when we
Well,
talk
in the
about,
same way that, you can't really perceive air apart from how it, physiologically feels, but it still exists.
right. So when we talk about an entity that is both part of what we know to be the physical universe, but then also violate one of the very fundamental things about the universe, that's when things start getting interesting, because we do know that entities cannot be in two places at once unless we are talking about some weird quantum entanglement, which, okay, then now we're getting into a really funky area of physics that is way beyond me and probably a lot of other people in the hangout here. So
I don't know
what?
if there's anybody in the hangout that would be qualified to tackle that particular topic. Like
Yeah.
I have astrophysicist friends who work for NASA and have, digged around with theoretical physics and will give me, because I write sci-fi for a living, so I contact them fairly frequently to ask them, okay, so if we took two supermassive black holes and there was an entity that somehow had the technology to begin dragging them together, what the fuck would happen? I ask them those sorts of questions, and even they would have a difficult time with that shit.
Yeah, I've stayed silent. I have a lot of opinions on what we're talking about, and I think I could probably add to it. But most of my knowledge on this, I have very little knowledge of physics. What I have done is read a lot of science fiction. So I'm just biting my tongue. Like, I'm not gonna put my foot in my mouth. So I'm just gonna listen to people, and I'm enjoying it. But I just wanted to put that in there.
All right. So
It is
uh,
certainly a mystery how God could be and perceive everything in the universe, and how he could know at the same time what I say and think, and another person on the other side of the globe. And I as well think that maybe a parallel would be, like, for example, I can perceive the sensory input of my foot at the same time as the sensory input of my hand. And I perceive, I have many sensory inputs of my body which I can process at the same time. So that maybe could be a parallel to God, being able to process information from many sources at the same time.
So in your example, what I see is a bit of a disconnect in this analogy is that that is part of the same substrate. And I'm going to try and use that word in the most broadest of sense. The reason you can feel different parts of your body is because they're part of the same physical structure, right? You have an entire nervous system that is interconnected and designed to, and I'm going to use that word, designed to receive those types of signals. So
You could
unless
even just say, you could even just say, if you wanted to say evolved to, or is capable of, you could just say is capable of.
Right. So this substrate that you and I and all of us have is capable of doing something like that. Now, what I would challenge people to do is, if we're going to draw that type of analogy, how is it that this entity can perceive these events telepathically throughout the entire universe? What is interconnected that it's actually using as a substrate to, in fact, do this?
Well, I don't think that anyone knows. That is beyond our understanding.
Okay,
But
so
what
now
But
that's
even if you're talking about telepathically, like, there would still have to be something that would interact with things in order to perceive them in the first place. And again, this might even just be because we're all evolved beings, and therefore we only can understand things in terms of the substrate. Perhaps there is something beyond that and we can't perceive it. But like, the problem is at that point you then have to admit that your thing that you're trying to conceptualize is incoherent, at least to our current knowledge.
Well, the only thing I think is uh, that there is no reason to think that it is not possible that God's mind can perceive at the same time information from various inputs, from various sources.
okay. So do you know of a way that one entity in it gets this type of information telepathically now?
No.
Okay, so we're postulating not only the entity, but also a mechanism in which we have no basis for.
Well, we
Yes.
we
No,
we
don't
can
have any
actually base it based on other things, such as Wi-Fi. If an entity has the ability to connect his, I guess, Wi-Fi mind to any part of the universe, and actually, like a spider, can sense every movement and actually be at every point just by his mind that is transcendent, then yeah, he can transcend time.
Except that the problem here is that Wi-Fi is a physiological phenomenon that we can actually measure. And when you're talking about a spider has, its legs on its web, and the vibrations from the web are what transmit that information. There are still physical mechanisms in both of those cases. Neither of those examples work. I mean, even Wi-Fi, even though we cannot see it like physically ourselves with our eyes, there is still a physical mechanism behind it that we thoroughly understand, which is why we can create machines that generate it.
Yeah, but I was just, my analogy was only going as far as, do we know something that can actually transcend, like it can share its mind with us? But when
Yeah,
it comes
I'm gonna.
to time,
Oh,
um,
sorry.
well, hold on. When it comes to time, that's a whole nother. That's a whole nother. We're just talking about infinities, which we do believe exist. So things can exist that we cannot fully explain because we can't get to the end of it.
I'd like to get
Yeah,
I'd
so
like to let
hold
Socka
on.
get in here because he didn't get a chance to talk. He got talked over twice.
Yeah, I'm actually going to agree with Hermes on this one, just in the sense that there's nothing impossible about this. We can propose some type of system like this, even if we were to propose like some type of idealist viewpoint of the universe, where of course God is omnipresent and omniscient because reality itself suffices on God's mind. Like these are things that you could propose. These are things that things that you could possibly point to.
None of them solve the problem of the infinite creator having to initiate change, therefore no longer being timeless problem, though.
Right.
We're
Yeah.
getting
So
into the weeds where that problem is still not solved by any part of this discussion.
Yeah,
But could we solve it?
that's what I was going to say. Is that even if you propose something like that to explain those attributes, it still doesn't get around the problem about this infinite being and what allowed it to create in the first place. And then on top of that, it also is something that I don't think that we could point to reasonably as the most rational kind of explanation for something, right? Because there's so many leaps that we have to kind of go to get to this point just to justify that position. That alone would be problematic.
Do everyone see my screen here?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is kind of my concept that I was trying to explain of the divine time paradigm, where, of course, this is what we're talking about as far as God not being able to change, because he's infinitely at all points in history, outside of history, and also in history. So, but there will also be a quasi timeless realm below that, and you cannot explain each step below below the timeless, like the pure timeless point. So it's just infinities that you can't untangle, but they exist. So each level
That's the problem, though, is if you're trying to propose this as a solution to timelessness, you would need to be able to some degree, explain each of these steps in order for us to get to infinity. Otherwise, you're simply admitting that your structure is incoherent and must be taken on faith.
Just to butt in real quick, the audience actually isn't seeing what we're seeing because the way the screen's set up, and I can't get to OBS right now. That'll be solved once I get my new computer. But yeah, we can see it perfectly, but the audience.
How do I do that?
It's not nothing on your end, Justin. He's taking pieces of what the program sees, and he's projecting it to YouTube. And so there's a program that he's using to do that. So it's nothing on your end.
Yeah, it's not you.
Okay.
It's on my end.
Okay, well, hopefully I can try to explain it. But but my point is that, like, you cannot count to infinity. It's just like we both believe in infinity, and we believe in several infinities of different directions. We believe they exist, but we cannot.
Infinity isn't a matter of belief, though. It's a mathematical proof, as Dragnauct explained before.
Okay, so then if that's a mathematical proof, then we can also just accept that on this subject, because you cannot, like, mathematically prove it by actually going there. You just accept it by the fact that numbers just go on forever.
I don't think that's the...
Dragnauct, can you try to explain a little bit about like how that works? Because this is the part I've studied this a little bit, but I didn't get that far in my maths courses. I kind of got to, I think.
Well, let's just assume this is a math situation. But
the problem is that you're wrong about you can't prove mathematically that infinity exists. So this entire premise that you're building doesn't make sense.
Okay, so let me agree with you, because just to go on for the sake of explaining this, let's assume this universe is based on the math that you guys have to actually calculate to infinity, right? So with that, each step, each infinite level, they're experiencing, or not just experiencing, but reality is going through a different...
So Drag, if you want to get this on Knock's screen like properly, you're going to have to shrink it a little bit and move it to the left.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Justin. I'm
So each reality would be going through a different experience of time. I mean, the universe itself would be moving differently, not just mentally, but just the whole universe itself in this universe of God. And every point here is God himself. So this is a purely pantheistic universe. Now, once we go below that, hold on, let me get to my screen. Wait, is this? Okay, well, anyway, once we go below that, there is this black line, or this kind of this difference right here. There is this is supposed to be the universe. Can you scroll down so I can see? Oh, wait. Is that me?
I'm screen sharing a picture that I took of your thing earlier, so I can show people.
Yeah, he's trying to adjust it. So Drag, you need to make it smaller and move it to the left a little bit. So like it needs to be significantly smaller, because Knock is only picking up like the left-hand side of it. And then, yeah, so like shrink it and then move it to the left a little bit, and Knock should be able to see it more. But like, I guess my left, so you're right, because there's a mirror thing going on with the stream.
Okay, let me see if I can do that.
Yeah, my computer's ancient. This will actually no longer be a problem in less than 2 months.
Okay, this is fine though. But basically, there's of course this oval, which is time, space, history, and in this universe, of course, there's temporality. There's a finite beginning, and then there's a presumably infinite future. But the line that separates time, our time, versus God's time, you cannot explain that. That right there is unexplainable. It's just the wall.
So you're admitting that this entire concept is incoherent and based on faith.
No, it's not. It's some things that cannot be explained doesn't mean it's incoherent. It just cannot be explained because
So I would agree. No, I would actually agree with you on the basis that things that we cannot actually explain, things that we contrive ourselves and then can't explain are different. Because I can contrive tons of things that are unexplainable, right? And so when we talk about things that are coherent that I have contrived, that becomes an issue, because then why is it then is this a descriptive, right, image or illustration of something that I have observed, or is this something that I've simply contrived that I'm using to try and act as a descriptor, right, of something that may or may not even exist? Because if that's the case, if it's the latter, then how do I go about falsifying this and making sure that it is the most accurate depiction of what exists in reality?
okay.
And for what it's worth, incoherent simply means it can't be explained. So me saying that it's incoherent, that doesn't mean that it is not understandable. It means that you can't explain it, expressed in a confusing way, unclear, etc. So when I define something as incoherent, what I mean is that it's not an idea that you can fully express to another person, which again makes it a problem as a descriptor or as any sort of functional definition or explanation for something. Because if you can't explain it, then how can it be if you can't explain it and you're the only person who seems to know it, then how could it be useful as an explanatory device of any kind?
Well, I thought incoherent just meant it doesn't make sense, or some things can make sense.
I think you can see it from that perspective too. First of all, the universe must have had a beginning, and it could not be eternal. That means that there was a beginning, and since something cannot come from nothing, then something created the universe. Now, the fact that we cannot
Okay, so now we're on Kalam cosmological.
Yeah, but the fact that we cannot enter in God's mind and understand how he can exist in a timeless dimension doesn't mean that it is not logical, or that it is not the best explanation for why there is something rather than not.
You're muted, Dragnauct, if you're talking.
Okay, there we go. How about that? Is that better? Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I think this is a part where a bit of special pleading tends to happen. So if we're saying that, just for arguendo's sake, Otangelo, something can't come from nothing, where in fact did God come from?
Well, God is eternal. He had no beginning. He
came from nothing.
No, that's
he didn't come.
He is eternal. He is the I am.
Okay, but then if God can be eternal, then how can the universe not be eternal? You can't.
Bingo.
Because the universe is in time.
Okay, but just
time.
Okay, but you just stated that God can be eternal just because he is, but you were saying that the universe has time, so it can't be eternal. But you guys also tried to claim that, because time can go on infinitely in either direction, or that the perception of time could be, quote, omnidirectional, just because, you could perceive time in that way, that meant that a timeless being could exist. Like, a timeless being could not exist both, because to come into existence there would have to be a change, but also that for a universe to come into existence there would have to be a change. So we're still back at that. But you stating, okay, the universe had to have a beginning. Well, it didn't have to have a beginning if God didn't have to have a beginning, and vice versa. You cannot special plead, as Dragnauct put it. You can't special plead that God doesn't have to have a beginning, but the universe does.
Well, the difference is that the universe is in time. And if you start counting...
Okay, but time comes into being because of change. So if God does anything, then he is subject to time.
as I said, I think that the moment when he started the universe, it was a simultaneous occurrence of cause and
But a
effect.
timeless being cannot change because time is change.
Well, I see it as I gave the example before. When I am dreaming, I do not
Okay, we're kind of
experience
running around
time.
chasing our
Yeah.
tails a little bit here. Like you're
Yeah.
kind of stuck on this Ouroboros where you're not really transitioning anywhere. You're not addressing any of my points. You're just repeating yourself.
This is
Yeah.
actually why he's banned from the atheist experience, by the way.
Real quick, let me interject. Can we stop screen sharing? I need to get to Twitter. Converse Contender is going to come in, and
Yep.
thank you. All right.
Yeah, this
Converse
is
Contender will come in. Yes, CC, I'll send you a link on Twitter. Hopefully,
yeah.
I think I have you there.
So one of the things, and Tangela, I talked to you about this before. When people are having conversations, people end up repeating things 50 times. We can go back and forth and disagree about things, but like we're back to just kind of repeating the same thing over and over and over again, and the objection never really gets dealt with. You just say okay, and then you kind of repeat it again. So just for your edification, this is exactly what me and Matt talked about as far as why they don't want you to call into the show anymore.
Okay.
Can I perchance propose just kind of switch directions here for a quick second?
Yeah.
Sure, go ahead. We're kind of stuck in an infinite loop anyway.
So it's interesting. Like I do find these conversations kind of interesting, but I think that we've exhausted the level of expertise that we can speak to, which is not the highest. Let's be honest. I think nobody here is mathematicians or astrophysicists or whatever that can really kind of explain these concepts coherently enough that we can really lead us to a really insightful conversation. I've listened to some people talk about these arguments before that are in those fields, and it's really interesting when they start getting into the topic of infinites and it is cool, but this isn't obviously like where our expertise lies. And so for guys like Hermes and Tangelo, like I'm like, this isn't what made you guys believe. Like you probably weren't sitting around one day and somebody came up with a version of the Kalam or any sort of thing.
Aw, is
like
that a Siamese?
Yeah.
Sorry,
And-
it's adorable kitty.
They didn't come up with he didn't hear this argument say like, hey, because of my my huge understanding of math and astrophysics and all this other crap, that this argument's obviously true and therefore I believe in God. This is the type of like ad hoc reasoning we do afterwards to try to justify things that can be seen as inconsistent within a belief that we hold.
Hey, look, Socka, you brought it all the way back to the very beginning of the discussion where we were talking about critical thinking. Good job.
So we get to this point here where
I would like to address two things. First of all, the justification that the atheist experience gave me is not the one that you told me about right now.
Okay, guys, this is not a drama channel. If you guys want to have that conversation out, please do it after the show. Like I'd like to have I'd like to have a discussion.
I would like to also give a reply to.
Okay, I'm saying, Tangelo, I'm saying no. You please don't. I'm sorry that Dragnaught did that, but I don't want to get into drama that happened on a different channel unless we set that out as the topic.
Also, I just want to finish my point there, Tangelo, if you don't mind.
Okay. Go ahead.
Because this is more directed at you and Hermes anyway. Is that like I see this as kind of like an ad hoc reasoning, where it's just like, okay, listen, we really need to harmonize these ideas. We have this timeless creator. We have this idea that like we talk about the created universe, and we need to come out with these ideas to help kind of explain what we observe and what we know about reality, and somehow get this in such a way that we can harmonize this with the beliefs that we hold. So when we talk about these arguments, like, well, it's interesting, and I do agree that they're interesting, that because of the level of expertise I believe that we're all at, this obviously isn't the reason why you guys are believers. So when I hear these arguments, when you guys are trying to make them there, it's like this is just it feels like kind of like a rationalization of what it is that you guys believe and trying to show that it can make sense. But I'm more interested in like that at this point in time, it's like that. Like, well, why are we going to these arguments? Like, what is the reason that you guys need to kind of put forward these arguments? What would they do to defend your faith? Why do you guys have this faith to begin with? What was the actual reason that made you guys believe that, in your particular flavor of deity, that you guys are arguing for now? Because like I said, I'm sure that this is not the reason.
Well, yeah, this is not the reason, but like you were saying, it's to make sense of what's possibly true. And the first reason why I actually believe in God is because I experienced Him and I've seen Him change my life. And reading the Bible just seemed to make sense of the world, as far as emotionally, and then also just the way the universe is here, simply speaking. Then the other thoughts, as far as explaining timelessness and why all that stuff can make sense, as far as what I read in the Bible, I'm looking at a God who talks about the future. He has this prophetic ability, in other words, to know what's going to happen. I have to decide on what philosophy I'm going to think on, like whether He made the future happen by just creating a domino effect that will just happen the way He organized it, or He just looks into the future. So I just keep thinking about how it can make the most sense with the information or the faith that I have, and that's how I come down to this view of time and God. But
there is one proposition there that I can partially agree with, because it's one of the justifications I have for my own beliefs, but the rest of it, I mean, basically, your personal experiences with deity, that's something that I can grant, because I can't speak to what you have or have not experienced. And, I have used my own personal experiences with deity for justification for my own belief. However, when you start to talk about, well, the Bible just makes sense and emotionally and all of that, you're effectively appealing to what Socka said you were. You're appealing to what is easiest. In other words, and what is most emotionally gratifying, rather than what is the most logical.
Okay.
Easiest in terms of perceiving things like, say, how the Big Bang works and such. You'd rather believe that a creator deity did that, which, for what it's worth, by the way, I'm also a theist. I'm a polytheist. I don't care whether or not my gods made the universe. Like, I believe that if they came into existence with it, they'd still be gods. But, like, when it comes to Christianity, this idea that God created the universe is so incredibly essential to a lot of you, and I don't really understand that.
Well, okay. Well, just a belief that if you believe the Bible, if you believe what God says, like He's a good person, He actually loves you, then you have to follow the idea that He won't lie to you. So then when you start,
I mean, I can start making quippy sound bites about whether or not God could be capable of love if He were timeless. I could make a number of quippy sound bites involving, well, God has done this, that, and the other, and these particular beliefs from the Christian faith kind of, don't line up. I could start talking about all the different ways in which the Bible contradicts itself, but, that doesn't really speak to anything that you just said either.
well, it does if you just let me explain. I mean, because of course things often understood when you look at it from a different perspective, and just because you're looking at it from maybe your perspective could be wrong. It isn't your perspective does not determine.
So could yours.
It could be. So that's why we think. That's why we talk. That's why I actually study, and I decide on what's true or not. I'm stuck here with just two eyes. So I mean, sure, I could be wrong. I could be totally wrong and end up in an oblivion. And, I say, hey, God, I guess God didn't exist, but I can also be right. And I mean, I just believe it. That's it. I mean, it sounds too simplistic, but it doesn't mean I have to throw away my brain and I have to avoid.
To a certain degree, though, you kind of do, because when you say, if you believe God's word, I mean, again, the general atheist response, and even as a pagan, it's kind of somewhat my response too, is how do you know that God wrote the Bible? And if you say, well, He inspired men to write it, well, at that point, you now have fallibility that comes into play.
Yeah, men are infallible. Even if it is the inspired word of God, you can't rely on men to exhibit it.
Even if
And so, like, the problem is that further we dig into that, that doesn't it doesn't invalidate the fact that most of what you just said was it's simple and it makes me feel good. Basically, like those are kind of, if you were to reduce those two arguments down, you said that you understand everything in the Bible and it quote makes sense on an emotional level.
Well, not just emotional level, but just it makes sense, and it also makes sense in emotional level. Like I'm not a Spock, and I don't think I was made to be a Spock. We were made to actually have all these, I guess, senses and your emotion and intuition that's included into you experiencing the world. So you don't just eliminate that from the equation of making a conclusion. Just like, for example, if someone decided to shoot someone in that face, something, there's parts of you that says, wait, that's not right. Your emotion actually may speak before your senses. So you don't just dismiss emotions. You don't put it
but
first.
quite often, like say my partner who has borderline personality disorder, quite often he'll talk about his anger flashing up and his physical reactions being to say throw something against the wall. Yeah, his emotion spoke before his senses. Does that make it a good thing?
No, I'm not saying that. That's my point is that you don't dismiss it 100%, and nor do you rely on it 100%. You don't rely on anything 100% because the mind is fallible once it's in the human body. So you
okay,
just,
so you think the mind is separate from the brain?
Well, no, I'm just using it in a figure of speech. But the point is,
well, you said the mind once it enters the body, though. Are you talking about a soul then?
Beyond, no, not. I'm just using that in a figure of speech. I'm just speaking, tongue in cheek. I'm not trying to be super accurate. My point is, if you're human, you're gonna be, you're infallible. You're fallible because you don't see every angle, 100% of the time, and you don't register every single thing 100% of the time accurately. So even if you use nothing but logic, you're only taking in the information that comes to you and that you could, understand. And if you don't calculate every point of logic correctly, you're bound to make mistakes at some point. So you can't even trust your logic 100% of the time because you're not always sure when you're right or you're wrong, because not all information comes to you fluently, just 100% of the time you understand every single moment and every single math equation. It's just so, but I say all that to say that logic, emotion, all that is considered when making a conclusion about any matter. And it's also important for making a decision about God, whether he exists or not. I don't dismiss emotion and say, okay, it's irrelevant. It's just not the thing I stand on.
I will disconnect here because it's late here where I am, but I will send to Dragnauct per messenger a reply to his argument that God is special pleading, and then we can eventually at another opportunity talk about that. Is that all right?
Sure.
Okay.
Well, thank you for coming on, and I did
Okay.
enjoy what bit of the conversation we did have, even if we did end up kind of chasing our own tails a bit at the end. It was an interesting bit of argumentation and thought exercise. It's one we haven't
Yes,
had on this channel in quite a while.
And if you have other opportunities, I think that what our friend said is certainly very important. That is experience and theology, direct revelation, Bible, and so on. But my faith is two legs. It is direct revelation through the Bible, and it's special also the creation, evidence in creation. And that's, of course, a huge topic. And there are many things that are related to that: origin of life, evolution, fine tuning of the universe, physical laws. Where did all this kind of stuff come from? There is a lot of things that can be talked about this. And I hope we can have some other talks and address these topics.
Yeah, I mean, we're always looking for Christians to come on, especially when we have open rooms to come and chat with us about their beliefs and stuff. So thank you for having the courage to come on and chat with us. Like, it was very, very, like, we're appreciative. There's a lot of folks who like to come into the side chats and things and talk a lot of shit, but don't come in and actually address us and have a civilized conversation. So, like,
Sure.
I'm not being derogatory at all to you and saying thank you.
Okay, thank you guys, and I'm always open to join the conversation and talk about this stuff. I enjoy it.
Yeah, thank you for coming on.
Okay.
Interesting. It's been interesting so far. It always is when Dragon Sock is on. Converse Contender is here as well. First time on my channel. I've enjoyed his. He's a seems to be a good dude. What's up, Converse Contender?
Okay.
Hey, how are
Have a
you?
nice
Am
talk.
I,
Good night to everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Bye bye.
am I audible at all?
Yep.
Yep, we hear you.
All right, cool. Appreciate you inviting me on, and Drag as well. Thanks to everybody for that, and I appreciate the opportunity. I kind of missed the whole conversation though, honestly, because I had my son today, and then I came home and got some dinner for my fiance and I, and we kind of been watching a movie. We just watched The Lincoln Lawyer, but I thought, hey, while it's getting toward the end of the night, I might go ahead and jump on for a little while to say what's up.
Well, if I can maybe kind of like just put us back where we were, the kind of the overarching theme here, and it has to do with we were talking about critical thinking earlier. And
What weight you well, you mentioned at the very beginning of this conversation, what weight you put on your emotions matters when it comes to determining whether what you're doing is confirmation bias or critical thinking.
Yeah, the evaluation of our own biases that we try to put into when evaluating any proposition is true or not. And so we kind of went down and we were talking about the Kalam a little bit with Tangelo and Adventus Hermes here. But the thing is, I think this is like I was saying, this is ad hoc kind of rationalization, ways trying to harmonize beliefs that people have with things that we know about reality, or things that we know about reality to a relatively high degree.
What is the ad hoc? What is ad hoc?
Well, I'm saying that that I don't think that a lot of people approach a lot of these arguments, like, for example, the Kalam, as from the position of complete neutrality, and say, just like, hey, that's a really good argument. I think I believe in the Christian God now.
It would be post hoc, I think, rather than ad hoc.
Sorry, post hoc.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Yeah, because ad hoc would be kind of off the cuff, whereas post hoc would be, after the event, after the belief, after rationalization.
Right.
That is correct. Sorry, my apologies.
Well, one thing is, don't expect me to try and argue for the Kalam, because Drag will tell you. He's asked me, did I want to come on with Alex Malpass and defend the Kalam, and I told him that I don't really promote the Kalam because I think there's too much room to wiggle in it. So, for example, in one of the premises, the universe began to exist. I think there's too much room in there. I've heard everything from well, there could be some unknown natural thing that was preceded the Big Bang, or there could have been I've just heard too many things, too much wiggle room, so I don't go down that, because if I'm going to argue a deductive argument, I want my premises to be completely airtight.
Yeah.
And so while there may be one more thing, while there may be some people, some philosophers that spend their time looking into all the objections and can handle all the objections to the Kalam, I do not spend most of my time doing that, so I'm just not the person to defend that.
Right.
Well, can I add? We have to ask the question about what's the difference between deductive, deductive thought process versus a post hoc process, because it sounds like the same thing to me. Like if you have a set of information, you don't know everything about something, then you're using deductive reasoning you're using some inference to come to a conclusion about things that you don't have flat out evidence. So that's what Christians are doing when it comes to the information they do have, and then they start doing deductive thinking. You may consider post hoc as if it's a bad thing, but it's something that we all do in every field of science.
I don't think that the point that Sokka was making was that a post hoc rationalization is necessarily a bad thing, and then that you correctly identified that would be the category, right, of what is happening, and then that's the technique that you had just mentioned of what is used to come to those conclusions. What the point that Sokka was making is that that's not what made you a Christian. But that's what we always end up hearing, at least some of us as non-believers. We hear the post hoc rationalizations and not what actually brought you to the faith to begin with.
Well, I think
Well, and the answer
Well,
for most people that I've met was they grew up in it generally. Like, that's what brought me to Christianity when I was Christian was I grew up in a Christian family.
yeah, but I
well,
haven't actually had that experience. Whenever I typically ask people, they don't typically say, "Well, because I was brought up in it." I mean, matter of fact, a lot of my friends were brought up in it, and they tended to leave the faith. So, for example, I did. You could say I went to church with my grandma when I was a little kid, but my immediate family weren't really church going family like that. So, but I grew up more secular, playing in punk bands, skateboarding, this kind of thing. Just your normal, everyday secular style life. I mean, I did have my grandma that kind of tried to push me toward Christianity, and she was an awesome person. So, I always looked up to her. But I feel like whenever I came back, it was a lot of it was because of the person of Jesus and so on and so forth. But it wasn't necessarily because I was raised in it. And I understand that there may be some people. I've heard a lot more Muslims admit that it's because they were raised in it. But I haven't heard so much of that. But again, I don't think you're trying to make the genetic fallacy by saying how a belief originates, that therefore it's wrong. You're not doing that, right? You're just saying
No,
that
I
that
was
was
just stating that that seems to be the most common thing is that people are exposed to this idea through their upbringing. I've met a few people who were converted later in life, and almost all the pagans I know converted themselves later in life because pagans don't proselytize generally. There are a few groups that do, but very, very, very few. Most of the Christians that I've met, on the other hand, did grow up as Christian, not in the least because we live effectively in a Christian hegemony to a certain degree. Like our culture is very steeped in Christian tradition, and the majority of people in this country are Christian.
well,
sure.
I wanted to
Go
answer.
ahead.
I wanted to answer what's Dragnaught kind of clarified. He was saying that basically we come up with these explanations, but none of these explanations are the reason why we become Christians, which is a lot of these explanations aren't. But the reason why we talk about them is because a lot of atheists or non-believers would say, "Well, we don't believe because of this. This doesn't make sense." And I would believe if this made sense. So that's why we go through the thought process of explaining these things so that it will make it easier for a person to at least be open-minded that, hey, this idea that they believe in could make sense in this realm that is bothering me. Like I can't be a Christian because I don't understand how could God be timeless and then also create something. Like we're trying to help you, at least believe this. If this is a little stumbling block, then we're trying to smooth it out. That's the reason why we talk about it.
I
Honestly,
can.
like I don't want to I don't want to hijack the conversation, so I'm going to say if you'd like to come back on the channel sometime in the future, I'd love to have a conversation about how you think being a Christian would in some way help me. Just because the religion itself, the part of the reason I left it is because it doesn't. But anyway, go
Well,
ahead,
I
Dragon.
would go ahead. I'm sorry. I want to answer that whenever you get done.
Yeah, oh no, I would actually. That's an interesting question, and that kind of actually is a better question than what I was going to get into. I have heard that before, that somehow Christianity is supposed to help people. I have plenty of anecdotes from people that that is the case, and I won't deny that that is something that I've heard time and time again. Even at my own university, it is almost put forth as a panacea of sorts for people who have mental illnesses. To which I did actually inquire more and
Oh
come to find
gods,
out
don't get me into that.
that and so Leakai, you and I share a very very strong feeling about that sort of notion. And I actually I have to ask, when you say that in not so many words that adopting this belief system would help someone or benefit someone. What specifically do you mean by that?
Were you talking to me?
Yeah, or
Okay.
converse. It doesn't matter.
Well,
Well, maybe I'll just say one thing here is that I don't think that people should be looking for beliefs for their effect. I think I mean that's maybe one reason, but I think you should only believe something if it's true, if it's the case. Now
Mhm.
we're going to justify things in different ways. So even if Christianity wasn't necessarily helpful to me, I would only want to believe it if it were the case. So there are many things that could be helpful to me depending on what my goal is. So, for example, if I had more of a hedonist view, I would not become a Buddhist monk because it would not. They teach to a lot of them anyway. I should say, teach to cut off your desires and try to live a desire-free life, and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't pursue that because it wouldn't help me in with my goals. But regardless of the goals, I would only want to believe something if it were the case and if it were in fact true. So I just wanted to say that first. But um, if it is,
there's a very interesting set of things that you could start getting into when you're talking about believing something because it's true, though, because both the way in which the Bible came to be a full document as we understand it today and many of the things in it, if not proven definitively false, are definitely not substantiated by a lot of the evidence that we have. So the
okay,
idea of I would only believe something if it's true becomes very, very messy when you start looking at, for example, biblical scholarship and history and which of the, for example, Paul's letters are counterfeit and things of that nature. If you only
give me
want
an
to believe things
example.
that are true, would a counterfeit letter from Paul then be a barrier to your belief in the Bible?
Only if that were the case, that would maybe that would at least say that those letters shouldn't be counted amongst the ones that. But I would just say that a lot of people who say that are not familiar with the criticism on the other side. So, for example, in textual criticism, the example you gave, you have the modern day textual criticism says it's what Bart Ehrman and a lot of Christian scholars as well buy into, and it basically says that we should go by the manuscript evidence that we get, and maybe some by some of the early church fathers writings, but mainly by the manuscript evidence that we have. So they look at like this very small few documents that are, let's call that they call the earliest manuscripts, for example. That is assuming, I'm completely fine with the method that they use, but I'm just saying it's not the only method. So they're assuming in that those documents which have, for example, are missing a verse or two, that those are the oldest. One of the reason is because they're shorter, and it
Okay, I
seems
think that there's a logical fallacy that you're applying here. You're assuming that, that the way that you phrase that, I'll backtrack a second. The way that you phrase that makes it sound like the scholars are assuming that these are the oldest documents because they're missing a verse or two, when quite often there's been dating methods done on them, the location and and areas in which they've been found, the period of time in which the dialects that
well, I
they're
think that
written
was
in come from. There's a lot of different ways that you can date something that have nothing to do with whether or not a verse is
um
missing.
yeah, I'm completely aware of that. Yeah, that wasn't I wasn't resting my case upon that they only date them based on shorter versions that are missing. They said that it's more likely that they were added to than taken away, for example. So there are other dating methods. I'll give you, for example, one. There's a criteria called the criterion of embarrassment. And I mean, I'm sorry, not the criterion of embarrassment. That's a different. The criterion, or the expansion of titles, for example. Just to give you another example to show you that I do understand that expansion of titles. There are earlier versions that say something like "our God," and there are later versions that say something like "our great God." And they say it's more likely that they expanded the titles out of piety. So I do understand those things, but rather the argument that I was making, it has no bearing on that. It's just to say that there are ecclesiastical texts that are not, there are texts that are not found in what they call the earliest manuscripts, which are quoted from earlier than the manuscripts that we have by early church fathers, for example. And when they look at these, they tend to say that, well, maybe it was just a sermon homily. It was just saying something that was certainly like it. But for example, in my Ante-Nicaeans Volume 5 book for the Ante-Nicene Church Fathers, you have a quote from Cyprian in the 280s, I believe, saying.
Yeah, but I think that like quoting earlier manuscripts and determining which of the earliest manuscripts are not the only methods that I've heard used to determine that some of the letters of Paul were forged. There were also things like analyzing the style and rhythm and such of diction and other writing,
Sure.
which is something that you can actually do right now with a computer. There are programs where you can put in samples of somebody's writing or somebody's Facebook page or something like that, and it will find everything that they have ever written across the internet, including places where they attempted to deliberately change their writing style, because there are certain patterns to and rhythms to the way that we use language that are so subconscious it's nearly impossible to change them. And
Sure,
when
but
they've
Paul is
analyzed
admitted.
things from that level, then there have been several letters of Paul's that, in addition to the other evidence, that has also added to the conclusion that several of those letters are forged. And actually, Knock has done a lot of research on this topic, so if he wants to address it, like, he'd be a fantastic person to talk to about
Right,
this.
but Paul admitted to having an amanuensis, right? So, I think that would definitely play a part in it, that Paul did have the what you'd call a literary assistant. So that would play a part in it, for example. But also, like I say, what you're reading are manuscripts though, of Paul's, and you might say, well, yeah, the literary style has changed a little bit, but the Bible admits in Paul's letters that Paul used an amanuensis, which is a literary assistant to help him with the writing
Okay,
and distributing.
but all of those written letters would still have those same sort of similarities between them that, you know, his direct manuscripts would, and they don't.
Right, but
Several of them have
but
a
keep
completely radically different than, you know, even if we were to assume there were two originators, some of them have such radically different styles to them that two originators would still not explain that.
right, but
And
keep in
again, that's not
mind.
the only evidence there is. It's just some of
Well,
the evidence
well,
that refutes your idea of the earliest manuscripts are the only argument.
Well, no, no. I said at the beginning, I didn't. I don't just think that they base it off of the earliest manuscripts. But keep in mind, as an atheist critic mentioned to me before, when I said they tend to say that these are the earliest, and he goes, "Yeah, but don't make the mistake that some people do and say that scholars say that these aren't Paul's writings. Rather, they say something like they seem to be different from his other writings, or they may not be original to Paul." But they do not state conclusively that these are not Paul's letters. So maybe you would, maybe there's a, maybe you would want to use a different or better example that would show Christianity to not be true, rather than something that could or could not be the case. For example, with Paul's writings, or the method by which they were copied through manuscripts, or so on and so forth.
I actually don't know much about the letters, so Ali, me and you are gonna have to talk about that. Um, I take issue with the fact that Paul announces himself an apostle and claimed to have divine word from Jesus himself. And I take a lot of issues with Paul, but I don't know this particular issue, Ali. And my research on Paul is incomplete. I keep putting it off because stuff like tonight happens, and now I learned something new, and now I got to go look into this shit.
Well, I'm sure
Well,
y'all
if you
know
want, I
other
can get some
examples.
sources from Chris as well, because
Yeah,
Chris
I got to
has
still
a
talk to
bunch
Chris,
of
and I want to talk to
stuff
Dr.
that are.
Josh.
Who,
Yeah.
Monty, or
No,
No, no,
Josh-
different.
Chris used to be
Well-
biblical history skeptic, though
well,
she's been on a hiatus.
Oh yeah, Dr. Josh.
Time.
Not. I don't want to talk
Yeah,
to Dr.
I
Josh
was about
about
to
this.
say
I want
he's
to
an
talk
Old
about Dr.
Testament.
Josh about it, an overview of my history shit that I'm trying to do.
Gotcha.
I mean,
So,
honestly,
but I'm sure
there
you can come up with other
are tons
examples.
and tons of other like historical examples of things that very clearly did not happen. There's no
Sure.
evidence of, you know, Jewish enslavement, for example, in Egypt.
Well, I would. Did you want to? I'm sorry if I interrupted you.
No, like that's one of the big ones. Also, you know, things having to do with the Red Sea and the fact that there's absolutely zero evidence of any sort of crossing of the Red Sea. Things of that nature. Like there are a lot of stories in the Bible that that could not possibly have happened. There's no,
The
you know,
the
geological
global
evidence
flood
of a global
has
flood
been thoroughly
either.
debunked, and That's usually my favorite
there's-
go-to in these arguments is the global flood has been debunked since like the early 1800s or late
Okay, well,
1800s,
there's a
something
few
like that.
things. Right, there's a few things there. So, for one, I would want to know in I'm sorry, your name if I mispronounce it. Alec.
Call me Allie if you have a hard time with my name. It's
Okay.
Haida.
I had a hard time with her name at first.
Yeah, it's
Ellie?
Aliakai.
Is that Hawaiian?
It's Haida. It's a sort of weird English version of Alakide, which means Lady of the Dogfish House.
Okay. All right, because I just got back from Hawaii a couple months ago, and I heard a lot of names that sounded similar. But anyway, yeah. So with your example, I would just ask, like, what archaeological evidence or what kind of evidence are you talking about for the Red Sea, for example? And then with Nakasuchi, I would just point to the fact that I don't actually buy into a global flood. I buy into a regional flood.
Yeah, and that's a good
Well,
apologetic.
And to be honest, the regional flood is far more likely. Like, there is some evidence that a regional flood may have happened in Fertile Crescent, and a lot of stories may have happened. But the thing is, though, when you start talking about truth, the Bible says that it was a global flood.
When did it say that? I mean,
it says that
like John Walton, for example, who's a scholar. He says that that it's his model is a regional flood, and he's a Semitic language, like he's an expert in ancient Semitic study. So I would just say that, for example, he and Dr. Michael Heiser, who's also an ancient Semitic language expert, they both accept the regional flood and say that that's more likely the model. But what they do is they base it off of, number one, the text, but also their closest neighbors and their text. And so basically they take a more scholarly approach. Now, there are terms, for example, where you would say something like it like the flood. I don't remember the exact terminology, but it covered the whole world or whatever it may be. But obviously, the term world is used, cosmos is used in multiple places to not mean the entirety, but rather something like the known world, where it's used to mean something like that. So I would just look to them for your resources on that material to show that it's not just like I'm making up something, but rather they have literature to back up what I'm saying.
Oh yeah, I've definitely heard this before, and it's because I think the timing gets messed up, but there was a regional flood in that area, but it was considerably before the Genesis story. But yeah, anybody else feel free to pipe in. I know we've been kind of ranting and rambling.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I believe in a global flood, and I believe the evidence. I mean, talking about how there's people from different backgrounds who don't really have connections, having this global flood tradition. You may say, well, in their tradition, it didn't mention the whole world, but nevertheless, the idea of making a boat versus just moving to the closest mountain or just moving to a different land, that would make more sense than creating a boat, if that was the case.
Well, by regional, I can mean the entire Persian Gulf. I don't have to necessarily mean like just one little village or something.
Well, even that, but we still know that these people walk and they travel great distances. I mean, they could travel a great distance if they were told by God that you have to prepare for.
Well, it doesn't say they were told by God. It says that Noah was told by God.
Yeah, Noah. So
in all fairness, yeah, they could travel great distances, but I mean, it took them 40 years to make a trip that you could walk in like 8 days.
Well, exactly. So it took them 8 days. It could have taken them 8 days, right? So if they could have taken just like 8 days, or like, let's say a whole month, where God in the text gave them 120 years, he could have definitely gone somewhere to get away from the flood.
Okay, but if you're talking about the boat, though, like, not to bail Converse Contender out, but at the same time, there have been a number of things done on the Ark, and with the dimensions given in the text, it could not have floated. Like, it was not a device that would have functioned on water.
Well, okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, here you may have to give some special pleading, considering that God is in control of the flood. But there's different ways, like considering how insanely destructive the flood had to be to destroy the whole world.
Well, why would you give such incredibly specific numbers of how big and exactly what dimensions this boat was if it would take God power to like float it? That doesn't make a lot of sense on the part of the authors.
Well, see, the thing is, God doesn't tell us to do things that he tells us things to do what we can. He wants us to play our part. He doesn't do everything for us. He could have just put them in like a bubble and not have him make a boat. But God wants us to do everything.
Why?
Well, because he didn't make us to be lazy.
Okay, that doesn't make sense.
I would say that God uses means. So, for example, if I made a video game, in order to produce some effect in the video game, I would use a mod. I wouldn't just snap my fingers. For example, I would use, if I created a material world, I would use the material world as my means to an end. For example, so I just used the fact that God uses means of the world to produce effects in the world.
Yeah,
but again, that still comes back to that particular boat would not have floated.
Well, how do you know? Wait, what do you mean? What part of it would not float?
The sheer weight of the material, among other design flaws in the way that it said that it is constructed, it would not be capable of floating on water.
Oh wait. What's the weight size? I mean, because there's boats that are made out of pure metal. What are you talking about? What do you mean?
Hey, so okay. So obviously we're not going to we can agree that wood and steel are have different strengths, right? Like that you'd have to use a lot more wood to equal the strength of steel, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about floating, or it?
Yeah. So you take it from the perspective of somebody who sails for a living. Do you know how thick the metal on most ships are?
Pretty thick, I imagine.
No, less than half an inch.
Well, I'm sure they're heavy. I'm sure. Let's say I'm sure it's heavier than wood, though.
Yeah, well, but that's the thing, is that if you want something to be strong, okay, so if you have a large ship that's made out of metal, okay, you can keep metal relatively thin because steel itself is a very strong metal. And plus you get a lot of good things out of steel as well, is that with most metals, it can twist. That it actually absorb some of the effects of the ocean on it. Like I've sailed in hurricanes before. Like it's not an enjoyable experience, and I wouldn't want to do it on a wood boat. Now, if you wanted to make something strong, okay, but the only material that you had access to was wood, okay, if you wanted to keep that comparable or to the strength that you would get from a steel ship, it wouldn't just be a straight, okay, well, we're going to make it, this thick. We're going to make it as thick as we'd make a steel ship. You'd have to make it thicker. But because it's also a weaker material, if you wanted to equal the strength that you'd have from steel, it wouldn't. You'd have to use more wood. In the end, to keep something made of wood, to keep it as strong as it could to survive those seas, with the same type of strength that you get from less than half an inch of steel, you'd have to use more wood. In fact, you'd have to use more wood that would weigh more than the steel itself. And then you run into a bunch of other logistical problems with this, with the fact that, like I said, is that when a wooden ship, especially when it gets to a certain size, like the proposed by the arc there, when it twists, what happens is that the wood doesn't have the same type of give that metal has, especially when it's built that thick. So when it's built that thick, and to equal that strength that can survive, certain sea states, like a violent storm that lasts 40 days, you're going to be talking about something that has a weight that would weigh more than the same ship would have made of steel.
And that's not even talking about the way in which it would have to be designed, which, again, the dimensions and such of it are given in order to hold the weight of every single animal on Earth.
That's just kind of part of the issue. There's also a bit of an issue with where did all the water come from, why hasn't the world?
There's a lot of issues.
There's a huge issue with the fact that you have more water than actually would presently exist on the Earth, and that the amount of energy it would take in order for it to rain enough for it to do that would literally cook the Earth. But there's
but if maybe I could add something to that. So I typically point to Michael Heiser and John Walton's book, like John Walton's book on the I think it's called something like the Lost World of the Flood or something like that. So I don't have all the answers to the biblical. So like if you could bring up like multiple passages where I'd have to go into the ancient languages, and so I would just point to the ancient language experts on that. But with your point about, well, hang on a second, because if you think about it, like there's all kind of barriers in the natural world to these things occurring. Even on a regional flood, I think you would be more obliged to say, okay, then it makes more sense on a regional flood. But still, there could be even natural problems with that as well in nature. But I think when we're if we're looking at the text as like, because I could be convinced that there was a worldwide flood, like I could be convinced, but I'm just not convinced. But either way, I look at this as another miracle claim, right, from the Bible. Now a lot of times we look at miracle claims and go, well, hang on a second, because it seems that miracle claims seem to be all over the place, right? But the Bible's kind of like ESPN highlights, like it just gives you like the reason why they wrote them down, like they didn't write down some of the normal things, for example. But if we're looking at the flood as, like a miracle claim or like some type of supernatural claim, I think that for the God that created the universe, like it would be, I know you would agree that it'd be trivially easy for God to create a flood or something like that. For example, if we're just doing an internal critique and just looking at the worldview in which this comes out of, that
Well,
wouldn't
sure.
be necessarily difficult. But I get your point about um, the effects of the flood. So,
Well,
for
and
example, on the
yeah,
global scale, one more thing here, on the global scale, like you would wonder, like, well, if the whole world was flooded for that long, like, what did the animals eat when they got off the ark, for example, and things like that. So, like, I can understand like some of the questions that would arise, but like in the actual what happened, I think we could, obviously you could look at the worldview and say, well, if God created the universe, it'd be trivially easy for him to flood the earth, for example.
right.
Right,
So
but the problem with this, sorry, Drake, can I
go
jump
ahead.
in?
Go ahead, man.
Yeah, the problem with this is that once, and I don't want to demean it, like when we talk about miracles, like it almost seems like we're just talking about magic, but like the issue with this
I
is that
mean,
when
I
you
have
have
yet to have found a Christian who can explain the difference
hold
between
on, sorry,
miracle and
hold on,
magic.
Ali, hold on, Ali. The issue with that is that you are weakening, any type of explanatory position automatically once you invoke any type of miracles into it. When you have the suspension of natural laws in this
You're
way,
weakening what?
you're weakening any explanation, because yeah, you're right. If you could propose an omnipotent being that can do absolutely anything, it could do things this way, it could do things that way, it could explain everything, as well as it could explain the counterpoints, the counterfactuals of all those things as well. You literally have something that can explain absolutely every scenario, as well as the scenarios that would contradict the original scenario that you're trying to explain. When something has absolute explanatory power, it
Sure.
has no explanatory power.
Sure. Well, yeah, Leonard Susskind said something like that about the multiverse. He said something like, "Theory that explains everything explains nothing." So I can see where you're coming from, but my point was simply that when we're looking at these things, for example, like if I come to an atheistic worldview, I can't go, "Well, where's God at in your worldview?" What I'm saying is, if we come to a theist worldview, which has supernatural implications, we need to look at things that are, said to be miracles, and then we need to go, okay, so if I'm going to critique this from an internal critique perspective, like which a lot of people, philosophers want to do as to be consistent, then they go, like, here's what I like to say, like when somebody asks me about miracles and they go, you know the laws of gravity, the laws of nature, and you believe a guy could walk on water, and then like literally walk on water, and then I like to say things like, I like to say, no, that is a stupid claim if your worldview is correct and natural, like there are only natural things, for example. If it's the case, but the Bible's claim isn't that Christ naturally walked on water, the claim is more likely something like the God that created the laws of nature, it's trivially easy for him to walk on water, for example. So all I was pointing out is not that that is a great explanation from a critical point of view, but rather the when Drag brought up the flood and what about the natural implications of the flood, I was just pointing out that, well, hold on, because on an internal critique view, you want to take the worldview that you're, in a supernatural thing. Now you might say, well, hold on a second, but I don't believe in supernatural, or there are other objections outside of that. But just to that one point, like explaining a miracle, of course, if the claim is that somebody naturally walked on water, you can go, well, no, we know the laws of physics, but that's not the claim. You get that, right?
Yeah, I do get that. I'm just saying that when you posit, the point that I'm trying to put out there is that when you include miracles, when you include something that can just bend and twist reality as we know it, that we can explain things that when we can explain anything this way. And the important part about this is that we're not just explaining what we observe, but we're also explaining things that we wouldn't expect to observe, and we're explaining things that would contradict the observations that we have. Like all these things together means that what you're positing as an explanation for those things becomes a really bad explanation, because I can use exactly the same arguments and explain like they said, like the counterfactual to that, and still have exactly the same amount of veracity to that claim, with the same amount of support for that claim as I would for what you're invoking when you're trying to explain something in the Bible.
But I see what my friend is saying. Converse. I mean, yeah, if you're granting us God, period, that by definition is an unexplainable thing. That is a miracle. He's a walking miracle. So to just then change the rules and say, well, this walking miracle cannot do miracles for you can't use him as a miracle maker as an explanation. I mean, that's like saying, well, if there's a bat and there's a baseball and there's a guy named Miracle, if he hits the ball out of the stadium, and you say, well, you can't explain it by miracle. You can only explain the bat and the ball. How did the bat and the ball, cause the ball to just go out the stadium? I'm going to say, well, the guy named Miracle, he's the one that hit it. I mean, he used the bat and he also hit the ball. So I can explain the ball and the bat within the realms of science, but this person, he's a miracle. He did that. So that's what's happening. You want us to exclude the very thing that you granted us, which is God, who does miracles.
It's not that I'm excluding it. We're talking about the weakness of an argument. We're talking about whether or not that argument or the proposition that you're putting forward contains, what we would consider explanatory value. Okay, so let's take a look at something like the fine-tuning argument. Okay, where they say this, like, well, look at the universe the way that it is. That the likelihood of life is so unlikely that there has to be, for life to exist where it is now, it could only be possible because of a God.
Mm-hmm.
And that is explained through the existence of a God. But if a God existed, a God could also create a universe that was totally tuned for life. And if we lived in that possible reality where the universe was tuned for life, we could say, well, look at this. The universe is tuned for life, therefore God exists. We can take a look at the human body. We can say, like, well, look at the human body and how complex it is. And complexity is a sign of design. But then you could also take a look and be like, well, let's imagine we live in a world where the human body was incredibly simple. And you can say, well, look at how simple the human body is. And simplicity is a symbol of design as well. The point is that, like, when you posit an explanation that can explain something as well as the counterfactual to that thing, what does that point actually explain? Because you posit an entity that explains everything, then all of a sudden it weakens any explanation that you're going to put forward.
Well, I have to disagree with you about the counterfactual, though, because, for example, I wouldn't run the argument that way. I'd say something more like, okay, well, if there was this God that created, uh, created the universe, a multiverse for human life, for example, we would expect there would be, for example, orderly laws of nature. There would be things would be ordered, for example. And
sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off there. You're putting what we observe as something that we expect. Like, but there's nothing inconsistent with saying that if an omnipotent being did exist, that we could also live in a chaotic universe.
Well, that's what I was about to say next, was that the counterfactual of an orderly universe would be a universe that was not ordered, right? And I would just simply say something like, well, if a designer created the atmosphere or the universe, for example, for life to flourish, then we would expect an orderly universe. But and then I would, you could run a parallel argument that we would not expect a chaotic universe, for example, for life to flourish, because there could be people popping into existence and then popping out in the next second, or there could be, fire just popping into somebody's home, for example, at any point, or chaotic things do not promote, an atmosphere for life, for example. You could just run a parallel argument on that.
Right, but you're saying that a chaotic universe that could not be brought about by an omnipotent God?
I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying that we wouldn't expect a chaotic universe that doesn't. And I'm saying
Why wouldn't we expect that?
if on the God model, if we expect a God, for example, well, we have to take what we expect. So if we expect a God that created the universe for life to flourish, for example, then we would expect that it would be orderly for the flourishing of the human, or for the life.
So
But
I'm gonna cut in a little bit. I've waited very patiently, but the problem is that if a god were to create a universe that is, good for life to flourish, it would not look very much like ours. I
well, I
mean,
can agree
granted,
with
the
that.
particular laws of physics that exist eventually can allow for life, but that doesn't mean that it's anywhere close to fine-tuned for it.
Yeah, but I could totally agree with that. And the theological perspective just says something like, um, humans lived in a place that the Bible calls Eden. Now, whatever that is, that'll be a theological view. But that humans were expelled because of some circumstances that occurred, and then that the earth, they were banished to the earth, to a cursed world that brought up thorns and thistles, for example, and things like that. So anything that you can run and say, well, hang on a second, because this isn't necessarily orderly. Think about cancer. Think about wisdom teeth. Think about all these different things.
I'm not even talking about orderly. I'm talking about the idea of fine tuning. Like, granted, again, this
Right.
universe, because we are here, we are life, and we are talking, it obviously allows for life, but the vast majority
Sure.
of the universe is completely inhospitable to it. Beyond that, though, I want to backtrack to something else. You believe your God is omnipotent, and yet you were talking about a chaotic universe and how a chaotic universe would not be sustainable for life. But would a God that is omnipotent not be able to create life that would be ideally suited for a chaotic universe? So your entire argument there does not make sense.
In fact,
What was your claim about the?
if the universe itself was chaotic and life somehow managed to exist, that would be a better, I would say that would be a stronger example of the existence of a God, explained by the existence of a God. Like, look at how chaotic this universe is, but yet life manages to exist. Like, that would be,
but
you could put
think
forward
about
that
it.
idea and it would make more sense.
Well, and not
that a
only
God would
that,
actually
though,
exist.
if
Well,
we
there's a
were
lot
the
of
life
points
in
being
that
made
chaotic
here,
universe,
obviously.
though, that chaos would be as normal to us as order currently is. Like, we have a hard time understanding what life would
Yeah.
look like in a so-called chaotic universe, using the Greek definition of chaos, literally anything can happen. And yet an omnipotent deity would create life that would be adapted to that universe. So they would have a hard time understanding how life could exist in an ordered universe.
Well, there were 3 points there, so I'll try and backtrack. One, I would say this last claim that chaotic universe would become normal to us the way, but on your own admission from that definition, chaotic universe means that literally anything can happen. I don't see how that could become ordinary. Anything can happen at any point, so I would disagree with that. And then there's the other claim that well, hold on a second, because if an omnipotent creator created this, it's all powerful. It could bring, it would be more godly to bring life out of chaos. For example, that's what the Bible says, that in the beginning that God took the void, the chaos, and and ordered it. So that is a claim made, and so I would just point to that. And then I don't remember your first point,
I don't understand
Kelly.
why an omnipotent God, why it would, why they would necessarily make a universe more orderly. An omnipotent God would be capable of, creating life in a perfectly chaotic universe. And again, we come back to a timeless, omnipotent, omniscient,
Well,
etc. God would have no reason for anything, which I don't
well,
recall if you were actually a part of that section of the discussion, but timelessness basically strips away reasons. It strips away any sort of capability of,
how do you know that?
well, for one thing, because of the studies that we have done that showcase exactly how decisions are made. as evolved beings, we can only make decisions in relation to time. Without time, there is no decision, because
Right, but
time is change.
right, but that would be an argument from ignorance to say because of what we don't know what that we don't know what could happen outside of time. I
I
mean,
never said we don't know what could happen outside of time. I said time is change. Anything that changes would create time. So therefore,
right, but
timelessness would be a state of no change. So nothing could be created by a timeless God.
well, like for example, just take somebody like William Lane Craig, who a lot of people don't respect for necessarily, but like he studied time for 11 years, and so like I'm not qualified as he is to talk about these issues, for example. But like if you take somebody like himself, and then I think we're also assuming the A theory of time here. Am I right about that? Because if
This isn't an
we,
assumption. This is the way that time is actually
what about the
defined.
B theory of time though? It's not in the same passage of time as the A theory. So I don't think that would
Right,
actually
but
work on the
even
B theory.
yeah, but even though William Lane Craig says that he could potentially work out the Kalam on a B theory of time, he
Well,
doesn't
no,
like it.
he doesn't use the B theory.
Yeah, he uses A theory. Yeah,
Right.
one of the biggest counters that people have put forward for his argument is on a B theory of time. Every single moment past eternal is just as just as relevant as like the moment right now. Like that,
Right.
it's yeah. So they that an infinite time bubble, so they speak about it, would have no
Hmm.
need for something to clump.
Exactly, but his argument against it is merely that it's not intuitive. So in that sense, I don't think that obviously he doesn't think that he has a knockdown argument against it. He just says, appeal to your own intuition and see if that makes sense to you.
Yeah,
Now
I
I
mean,
don't have a
whenever
lot of time left, so I mean I only got a few
okay,
minutes, but I'll try and answer as many as I can. And Justin, if I'm taking up a lot of time, sorry about that, man. I didn't mean to
No, you're
kind of
doing
take
good.
over.
Well,
Uh,
I jokingly said we can go to 12:30 in the chat, but I do need to try to close it out by midnight. And CC, this is why I wanted to have you on, because you have good arguments and they usually come from good literature. So I appreciate you coming on. Feel free to dip
yeah.
out when you want, and yeah, come back on another time.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me. Like I say, I'm um I'm in a very rare state on YouTube because I had left for so long and came back. I kind of missed some of these squabbles that were going on, and so I'm picking up the clicks again. I actually remember Justin from way back. I was on YouTube and Google Plus back with the Google Hangouts and G Plus, and you were on there. Your name was different, but it was just you were going by your name, I think, Justin Wilson. But
Yeah.
you were in a lot of Hangouts with me and Evangelist Ken and a lot of those guys back then. And but it's been 4 years, so I'm sure you probably 3 or 4 years. I'm sure you probably don't remember that. But anyway, yeah, I appreciate you even considering to have me on. And again, I'm in a rare form here because I find a lot of atheists appreciating the fact that I'm taking their argument seriously and that I don't just go, well, it's just a stupid argument to get out of believing in God. Like I do take argument, like for example, the Pascal's wager. Like people ask me, like, well, what's the worst argument for God? Like I think Pascal's wager is because it's not even a good argument, and I'll admit things like that right up front. But I do buy into um, a lot of what the main core doctrines of Christianity are. I just have a different approach. I don't buy the old way of getting to that. So that's I've been
For what
well
it's worth, by
accepted
the
by both.
way, you and I discussing, I'm actually a theist, if you didn't catch that earlier.
Yeah, I
So,
did. Thought I heard that you were a pagan. I just had a
yes.
conversation with my friend Ocean the other day. So he was on my channel, and he is as well. And I'm sure you probably know him from
Oh
YouTube.
yeah, Ocean is actually a friend of mine as well. He and I met through Surus.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I came
So
over into Atheist Tube from Left Tube. I was good friends with Pig Puncher, and Pig Puncher introduced me to Surus, and Surus introduced me to Knock. But I'm a Hellenic polytheist, so I'm different.
okay. Yeah.
He's a heathen.
I actually asked
Yeah.
him about the Hellenic polytheism, and we had a conversation on my channel. I don't know, a week or so ago, and I asked him about. He's like, "Look, I don't know that much about Hellenism, honestly. I'm more in the. He's in more in the heathen. Is it? Um,
Heathenry
forget
is an
what the-
accurate name for it.
Okay, yeah. I was thinking more
Norse.
something more specific. Yeah, Norse.
that's
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, Norse
It's
reconstructions.
hipster paganism. Hipster
Right.
paganism. Like the,
Exactly.
I'll
beards
tell
and skinny
you,
jeans.
I'll tell you what I like immediately liked about UCC and some of the Christians I'm starting to meet now is you do have normal Christian beliefs. So like we would disagree about a lot, but you don't judge me. You never look down on me for being a raging atheist. You treated me the same. And I just don't get that from too many Christians. Both times Justin's been on my channel, he's been the same. It's been very civil discourses and conversations, and that's what I appreciate because too often I think Christians come on here trying to trigger me because I was easily triggered last year. But I really appreciate civil conversations.
Well, I actually, like I said earlier on, like when we were talking about is Christianity helpful? That's one claim, but like I would rather know, like, is it true, for example? And so if I hear an argument against Christianity, I want to know it because I want to know, is there something I'm missing? For example, a lot of people will tell me, they go, okay, well, what about this claim in the Bible? Like, what if this doesn't meet up with modern science or something like that? For example, and I like to tell them, well, think about a claim from the Bible, like God has the number of hairs on your head numbered. Now, if he were to told the ancient Israelites, I have all the molecules in your DNA strand numbered, they wouldn't have wrote it down because they would have thought God was just some crazy voice in their head. They'd be like, I don't know what God was talking about. So I think God reveals things to people in a way that they can comprehend, but also in a way that it can be read later and made sense of. So, for example, he may have said something like the circle of the earth or something like that, and then the ancient Hebrew. I can even give you that they might have thought something different. Like they might have thought the earth was circular and had like a dome or something like that. That doesn't matter to me because I can I can concede that they might have had a flawed understanding of some scientific premise. It makes sense, obviously, but that does not lend credibility to the fact that the Bible may be that the God that revealed things is incorrect. And so I would just say that with a lot of things. For example, like with morality, God might have there's a biblical principle that God tries to wean people like off of things. Like God, you give milk to the babes, and then you give meat to people when they're ready to eat meat. For example, a lot of people like to point to Old Testament passages, and then I like to say, well, why did Christ point to those same passages and say, "You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth," but I tell you, it hasn't been that way from the beginning. What he's basically saying, he's given tacit approval to the fact that, like for example, Christ will say, Moses gave you that law because of the hardness of your heart. Like he's basically saying, you guys were barbarians, you're barbaric, and God gave and Moses gave you certain laws because of how hard your heart were, because of how barbaric you were. But it was not that way from the beginning. So that's the approach I like to take to things like that, is that you got to be willing to look back at their point of view and their perspective.
So you did say one thing that I always like to kind of address, which is that like you talk about Pascal wagers and said that Pascal wagers not you think it's like the worst argument for God. What do you think?
Just so
the
you
best
guys
argument?
know, I'm gonna be having to get out of here fairly soon as well.
Yeah, I gotta roll
we've got
in a minute.
Yeah,
we've got snow coming like for the rest of this week, and my area is basically a single snowflake falls, and we're so ill-equipped that all the schools get shut down. So there's a very good chance that I live on top of a giant hill. None of my streets are going to get plowed. We need to go and try to pick some stuff up at the store before the snow starts falling.
Definitely.
So yeah.
Well, thanks
so just,
for the conversation.
Yeah. So just to that point, I have to get up here as well.
Yeah, I think it's a bad argument. It's just
I would love to.
Go ahead.
Oh, I agree. It's a bad argument. I would love to sit down, maybe on Rage's channel next week, and like discuss like one of the arguments that you think is a good argument for God.
Well, here's one thing that's different with me between me and other Christians. Or I don't take arguments and put a lot of stock in one argument. For example, What I like to do is I like to find out, what do you mean by evidence. So, for example, when I was talking with Steve McCrae, for example, which I know a lot of atheists don't like, so don't give me crap about mentioning him. But when I was talking to him, for example, I said, wouldn't you agree with me that evidence means something like, given a fact or some evidence, some body of facts or something, that it makes a claim more probable given those things or that thing than not having that thing. That would be, a roundabout evidential definition. And Steve
Yeah,
kind
I
of
would
he
just
critiqued it a little bit, but he agreed that given something about like that adds to its credibility, does provide evidence for it, whether it's good evidence or little evidence. And then I would
yeah.
run some. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I would say that, yeah, like I'm okay with that. I figure when somebody talks
Mhm.
about evidence, it's always just like, evidence is always the supporting, anything that supports an argument. Okay,
Sure.
so like, and just by the loosest of definition, is that if
Right.
you're positing this, evidence would be anything that you could put forward that could support that,
Right.
I like that, and that works. Then we would also understand that there's a standard to evidence, like that
Sure.
if we can say that something that's good evidence or that's bad evidence, that's automatically assuming that there's some type of metric in which we can take a look at something being considered good or bad evidence.
I
So, for
agree with
example,
that.
something that would be considered bad evidence would be something that, like I said, like what I said earlier, the universe could only be the universe. God must exist because the universe is fine tuned. But then again, like if the universe wasn't fine tuned, you could also use God as an example there. So like that's an example where just
Yeah,
like,
but I think that God would be less probable given a non-fine-tuned universe, for example.
no, I think that I don't think that you could put any type of probabilistic outcome on it. I think that it would explain both points. So like that's why I said that, the addition of God as an explanation, I never think there's a really strong one. But I'm willing to be like to be challenged on that.
Yeah. Well,
So I mean,
Yeah, I would love to
like if you
host
want
it.
to have so if you want to have a discussion with Raging, just going over what we can consider good
sure.
evidence for God, I would love to have that discussion.
Well, typically, the reason why I like to put it that way is because typically atheists, not all the time, obviously, I don't like to group, but a lot of times, or not a lot of times, I should say, sometimes atheists and agnostics will say something like, "Well, there is zero evidence for God," and in fact, a lot of will say that's their definition of atheism, is that by atheist I mean there is no evidence for God, and so I'd like to start with, well, do you agree with me on the definition of atheism, that anything that adds to the proposition being more probable exist as evidence? And then they say yes, and then I can say, well, good evidence or bad evidence. Take for example this argument or something, and then I would try to go from there. So I don't. What only thing I'm pointing out is I don't try to put stock in any evidence. I mean, any argument as the argument. So, for example, the Kalam, it may be a valid and sound argument, or as Dragnaught slipped up and said the other day, a salad argument, sound and valid. Um, but but
Salad, it's the short way to put it. Yeah, yeah.
right, exactly. That he slipped up and said that. And he goes, I mean, sound and valid. But anyway, so I don't use any of those arguments as like a proof text, for example, or a proof argument, but rather I would use other evidence, other claims to evidence, and then I would just, based on the person I'm speaking to's reason, say, would you not consider that, if not only uh, little evidence, wouldn't you not consider that as evidence at all? And yeah, I'd be willing to have a conversation with you guys, but typically the weekends aren't good for me. I spend the weekends with my son and fiance, so
Mhm.
Tuesday through Thursday are the best times for me. But I am going back to finish my degree. I'm starting back school next week, so um, try to catch me Tuesday through Thursday, but I'm going to be more limited going forward.
Yeah, we can work
Well,
something
I
out
could tell you,
between
yeah,
then.
from the 20th until the 31st of January, I'm actually off work, on vacation, so I'm pretty much available in that entire time.
If Tony Designs is still in the chat, Tony and MathPig run my Discord. Just send Sokka my Discord, and then
I'm in your
oh,
Discord.
you are okay.
Yeah, I just don't participate.
For some reason I was thinking you might have been, but all right. So yeah, just hit me up on Discord. Send me a message or something whenever you're available, and I'll let you know what my best times are.
Awesome, sounds good. And not the
I'm totally down for that.
And you too, Justin. Feel free to hit me up. Naka, you already got all my information, and Ellie as well. I'm pretty available. Find me on Twitter as well or whatever. So
Okay.
I do live streams, like I typically do them once or twice a week. So
on YouTube or
yeah, on YouTube I have, and I open up. A lot of times I'll do a debate or I'll do a chat, and then I'll open up a live stream afterwards, an after show, and just allow anybody who wants to come in.
What's your name again?
Converse Contender.
Oh, that's right.
Like conversation contender, like what we're doing now, contending in conversation. So
yeah, it's a good channel. I think it's gonna grow. I usually will catch the streams after work when you have them.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
I've definitely had a wonderful time talking with you, Converse. It was nice to meet you.
Me too. I really appreciate all the support and encouragement. I acknowledge that I could be wrong. I take kind of a fallibilism point of view. If you
so do I.
Never. Okay, I was about to say, if you never looked up the term fallibilism, like that's the type of view I take. So, but I just think that a lot of times both sides do it wrong. I think both sides typically do the conversation the wrong way. So.
Oh yeah, I agree.
Well, at that point, we can agree as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, perfect. Yeah. So that might actually be a good point to end on.
Yeah, I know. I've got to go to sleep myself. Justin, please come back on. Both times you've been on, they've been interesting conversations. I was tired to start the stream, man, I'm tired. So I'll give people final words, and we'll get out of here, and we'll do this definitely again, and we'll work that out between Socka and Converse. I'd love to host that.
Thanks for having me.
Yes.
Oh, Jill coming up. Tony's not even here anymore, and I think Jill's getting all timed out.
Don't worry. The entire mod team knows to time him out.
Yeah. Oh, Jill. All right, so any final words? Socka, thank you so much, man. It's been too long. Really glad you and Drag came back on. Missed these old. It felt like an old stream again, even though I wasn't partaking too much. I enjoyed it. It was fun.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate it. I'm going to have to drop right now as well because I got to get out of here before the weather gets too bad as well.
Before you go, Soccer, by the way, the chat noticed apparently I'd been cutting you off a great deal tonight. I hope that I haven't been too terrible. When we stream late, my medication starts to kick out, and I'm really, really sorry.
It's not a problem. You know what? It's I view it as karma for the years and years of hangouts where I did it to other people. And as Naka points out, sometimes you got to interrupt Soccer because once I go, it takes 30 minutes for me to stop.
It's a discussion, not a dissertation.
Yeah. So I'm okay with it. But on that note, I'm good. Thanks for hosting me. And I will just message me on Twitter or in Discord at my Bartholomew Roberts account if anybody wants to chat.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Socka. Thank you, Justin. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and just cut it to the closing scene. Thank you, Allie, for... we went pretty longer than we usually go tonight. Thank you guys for being here. It was a great discussion. Covered a lot of ground. We'll see you soon.